I'll never forget the look on my father's face when I asked about our family Christmas trip. The one I'd paid $15,000 for. The luxury resort I'd carefully researched. The experience I'd funded, because he said it might be our last Christmas together as a family. His response, a cold smirk. 6 words that changed everything. "We went last week, family only." I stood there speechless as he turned and walked away. No apology, no explanation. Just dismissal. Like I was a stranger who'd asked an inappropriate question. They'd taken my money gone without me, and the phrase "family only" made it clear I wasn't forgotten. I was deliberately excluded. But that was just the beginning. 3 weeks later, my phone rang. Same cold voice. "The house payment is overdue. Did you send the money?" Something inside me snapped. For 36 years, I'd been the family's designated fixer. The practical daughter. The one who sent money, solved problems, and stayed silent about mistreatment. I'd convinced myself that sacrifice meant love. But when my father demanded more money after excluding me from the trip I'd paid for, I finally saw the truth. I wasn't their daughter. I was their ATM. What I discovered next would expose a 15-year conspiracy that started with my dying mother's desperate attempt to protect me. A conspiracy involving forged documents, stolen inheritance, and a secret my father had been hiding since 2010. By the time I was done, the phrase "family only" would mean something very different. And he would learn that the daughter he'd underestimated his entire life had finally stopped playing by his rules. This is the story of how I took it all back. Part 1. The Smirk That Drew the Line. My name is Kimberly Martinez. I'm 36 years old and I work as a financial analyst for a mid-sized healthcare company in Phoenix. I tell you this up front because it's information my own family has never bothered to learn, or if they have, they've never bothered to remember. I've always been what my family calls the practical one. Growing up, while my older sister Rebecca was praised for her creativity and sensitivity, I was the daughter who didn't need much attention. When Rebecca struggled with math homework, our parents would spend hours helping her. When I struggled, I was told, "You'll figure it out, Kimberly, you always do." It sounds like a compliment, doesn't it? Like confidence in my abilities. But what it really meant was that my needs were less important, my struggles less worthy of intervention, my successes less worthy of celebration. By the time I reached adulthood, I'd fully internalized my role. I was the family's designated fixer, the one who handled problems quietly and efficiently, the one who could be counted on to send money when Dad's car broke down to cover Rebecca's mortgage payment, when her husband was between jobs to manage the family's taxes when they got behind with the IRS. I told myself this was what families did. They helped each other. I convinced myself that being needed was the same as being valued. Looking back now, I can see how carefully they'd trained me. Every time I expressed a need, I was made to feel difficult. Every time I shared good news about my career, someone would minimize it or immediately follow up with a request for money. I learned to stay small, stay quiet, and stay useful. It was easier than fighting for recognition I'd never receive. The Christmas trip incident started 3 months before the holidays in late September. My father called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice had that particular tremor he used when he wanted something emotional but controlled, vulnerable, but purposeful. "Kimberly, honey, I've been thinking," he began. "I'm not getting any younger. Your mother's been gone 13 years now, and I've been wanting to do something special. One last big family Christmas, while we're all still here and healthy enough to enjoy it." My chest tightened immediately. The invocation of mortality, of time running out, of last chances, these were the tools he'd always used to bypass my rational mind and tap directly into my guilt and fear. "I found this beautiful resort in Scottsdale," he continued. "Luxury accommodations, they've got this incredible Christmas Eve dinner, there's even a sunset cruise on the last night. It would be all of us, me, you, Rebecca, her family. Real quality time together. But it's expensive, and with the house expenses and everything, He let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging in the air. He didn't directly ask me to pay. He never did. Instead, he painted a picture of something precious and fleeting, positioned himself as unable to provide it, and waited for me to volunteer. It was a script we'd followed dozens of times. "How much, Dad?" I asked, already knowing I'd say yes, already calculating whether I could cover it without dipping into my emergency fund. 15,000, give or take. I know it's a lot, but I did the math, and with 5 adults. "I'll transfer the money," I said, cutting him off before I could think too hard about it. $15,000. That was nearly 3 months of my mortgage payments. But this was family. This was memory-making. This was, according to him, potentially our last Christmas together. "You're such a good daughter, Kimberly. Always so responsible. I knew I could count on you." Responsible. Count on. The words that had defined my entire relationship with my family. Not loved, not cherished, not valued, just reliable. Over the next 2 months, I researched every detail of that trip. I compared resorts, read reviews, planned excursions. I created a shared calendar with all the dates, sent my father the booking confirmations, and marked December 18th as our departure date. I imagined us all together, actually together, not just physically present, but emotionally connected. Maybe this trip would be different. Maybe this time they'd see me as more than just the practical daughter who solved problems. 3 weeks before departure, I called my father to coordinate logistics. "Dad, what time should I be at the airport on the 18th? Are we all flying together, or should I meet you at the resort?" There was a pause. Just a brief hesitation, but I felt it like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Then he spoke, and his voice had none of the warmth from our previous conversations. It was flat, almost amused. "We went last week." I didn't understand at first. The words made no sense in the context of our conversation, in the context of the calendar I'd created, the trip I'd planned for the 18th. "I'm sorry, what?" "The trip. We went last week. It was beautiful, by the way. The resort was everything you said it would be." My mind was racing, trying to assemble the pieces into something coherent. "But the 18th. We planned for the 18th. That's in 3 weeks. His voice took on a tone I'd never heard before, not quite cruel, but absolutely indifferent. There was even a slight smirk I could hear in his words. "Family only, Kimberly." I stood in my kitchen phone pressed to my ear, and those 2 words rewrote my entire understanding of my place in my family. Not, "I'm sorry there was a misunderstanding." Not, "We had to change the dates and I forgot to tell you." Just family only. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I went completely still, the way prey animals freeze when they finally understand they're being hunted. I watched my reflection in the kitchen window, a 36-year-old woman who'd just paid $15,000 to be deliberately excluded from her own family. My father said something else, I don't remember what, and ended the call. I set the phone down carefully on the counter. My hands weren't shaking. My breath was steady. But something fundamental had shifted. For 36 years, I'd told myself a story about my family. That they were thoughtless but not malicious. That they took me for granted but didn't mean harm. That if I just tried harder, gave more, stayed quieter, eventually I'd earn the love and recognition I'd always craved. But standing in my kitchen that evening, I finally saw the truth that had been in front of me my entire life. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't oversight. This was intentional. They'd taken my money, planned the trip for dates I couldn't attend, gone without me, and when confronted, my father didn't even pretend to be sorry. The phrase "family only" wasn't an insult, it was a declaration. I had never been forgotten. I had been deliberately erased. In the days that followed that phone call, I did what I've always done when faced with something painful. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd misunderstood the dates. Maybe there was a legitimate reason for the change. Maybe my father's dismissive tone was just stress or poor communication. But every time I reached for an excuse, I kept hearing those 2 words, "family only." There was no ambiguity in that phrase. No room for misinterpretation. I needed to understand how this had happened. So I went back through everything, retracing the entire process from the beginning. That first phone call in September hadn't been spontaneous. I realize that now. My father had prepared. The way he'd framed it, one last family Christmas while we're all still here, was designed to bypass my logical defenses and hit directly at my deepest fears. He knew I'd lost my mother 13 years ago. He knew that loss still shaped how I viewed family, made me desperate to preserve what remained. He'd weaponized my grief, and he hadn't worked alone. 2 days after his initial call, my sister Rebecca had texted me. At the time, I'd thought it was sweet her reaching out unprompted to talk about family plans. Now I saw it differently. "Dad told me about the Christmas trip idea," her message had read. "Kim, this could be really special. I know we haven't been as close as we should be, but maybe this is our chance to really reconnect. The kids are getting older, and I want them to have memories of all of us together. I think this could be healing for all of us." Healing. Reconnecting. Memories. Every word had been calculated to make me feel like this trip was about emotional restoration, about repairing something broken. And then came the crucial part of her message. "I wish we could afford to help with costs, but with Jake's job situation and the kids' school expenses, money is just so tight right now. I'm so grateful Dad thought of this, and I'm grateful you're in a position to make it happen. You've always been so good at handling the practical stuff." There it was. The gentle reminder of my role. The acknowledgement that I was in a position to pay, not because they'd asked about my finances, not because they knew anything about my actual situation, but because they'd decided I was the resource. And Rebecca's praise, "You've always been so good at handling the practical stuff," wasn't admiration. It was a leash disguised as a compliment. I'd transferred the money in 2 installments. The first $7,500 went in early October to secure the reservation. The second $7,500 followed in November for the remaining balance. I have copies of both wire transfer confirmations saved in a folder on my laptop labeled Family Important. I'd kept every email from the resort, every text message, coordinating details, every receipt. I'd created a shared Google Calendar that I'd invited both my father and Rebecca to, with the dates clearly marked December 18th to 23rd. I wasn't being paranoid or overly cautious. I was just being myself, organized, thorough, responsible. The same qualities my family had always praised in me when they needed something and dismissed as uptight when they didn't. I'd believed documentation was about keeping everyone informed, making sure nothing fell through the cracks. I'd never imagined I'd need it as evidence of my own erasure. But here's what haunts me most: even while I was being methodical, even while I was triple-checking dates and coordinating logistics, part of me already knew they didn't value me. I'd spent years watching Rebecca get praise for mediocre efforts, while my achievements went unacknowledged. I'd spent decades being called only when they needed money or solutions, never just to talk. I knew the relationship was unbalanced. I knew I was giving far more than I received. Yet I kept telling myself that family was family, that blood meant something, that despite everything, I belonged to them and they to me. I'd chosen to believe in a version of my family that was kinder than reality, and they'd exploited that choice ruthlessly. The photos appeared on social media 3 days after my father's family-only pronouncement. Rebecca posted them first, a series of images from the resort I'd selected. There was my father at the Christmas Eve dinner I'd researched, wearing a red sweater and smiling broadly. There was Rebecca with her husband and kids by the pool I'd read reviews about. There were extended relatives I barely saw, cousins, aunts, uncles, all gathered together at the sunset cruise I'd specifically chosen because the reviews said it was perfect for bringing families closer. The captions were effusive. "Best Christmas ever. So grateful for family time, making memories that will last forever." Rebecca had even tagged the resort and thanked them for their incredible hospitality. Not one photo included me. Not one caption mentioned my absence or acknowledged that I'd funded the entire experience. It was as if I'd never existed. I checked the dates on the posts against my calendar. December 11th to 14th. The exact weekend I'd told my father back in October that I had a major work presentation and couldn't travel. I'd mentioned it casually during one of our planning conversations, explaining why the 18th was perfect timing for me. It was right after my big project deadline. They hadn't forgotten that detail. They'd used it. The trip had been scheduled specifically for dates they knew I couldn't attend. They'd taken my money, taken my research, taken my careful planning, and orchestrated the entire event to exclude me while making it look natural. If anyone asked why I wasn't there, they could say I was busy with work. No one would question it. No one would know I'd never been invited. Sitting at my desk, scrolling through those photos of my family's joy I'd purchased, but wasn't allowed to share, I finally understood. The dates weren't a coincidence. They were chosen specifically because I couldn't attend. Staring at those photos, I realized this wasn't a new pattern. This was the culmination of a dynamic that had been carefully constructed over my entire lifetime. The Christmas trip wasn't an aberration. It was the most expensive iteration of something that had been happening since I was a child. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that my sister and I occupied different positions in our family's hierarchy. Rebecca, who was 10, had failed a math test. I remember coming home from school that day to find our mother sitting with her at the kitchen table patiently working through practice problems. Our father came home early from work to help. They spent hours reassuring her that she was smart, that math was hard for lots of people, that one bad grade didn't define her. That same semester, I brought home straight A's and a note from my teacher saying I was reading at a 5th grade level. My mother glanced at my report card, said, "That's nice, honey," and went back to helping Rebecca with her homework. When I asked if we could celebrate, maybe get ice cream like we had when Rebecca made the honor roll the previous year, my mother said, "Kimberly, you don't need all that fuss. You're naturally good at school. Rebecca needs more encouragement." I was 7. I didn't have the language to articulate what that felt like, but I understood the message. My achievements were expected and therefore unremarkable. Rebecca's required celebration because they were hard-won. My struggles were problems I should solve independently. Hers required family mobilization. The labels came early and stuck hard. Rebecca was the sensitive one, the creative spirit, the one who needs extra support. I was practical, independent, low maintenance. Those words sound positive, don't they? They sound like strength, like capability, like praise. But what they actually meant was that my emotional needs could be safely ignored without consequence. When Rebecca struggled with anything, friendships, schoolwork, later boyfriends, and career choices, the family rallied. When I struggled, I was told I'd figure it out because I always do. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I learned that asking for help resulted in disappointment or being made to feel like I was creating unnecessary drama. So I stopped asking. I figured things out alone because that was the only option that didn't result in being labeled difficult. My birthday parties got smaller each year while Rebecca's stayed elaborate. When I made the varsity soccer team as a sophomore, my father couldn't attend games because he was helping Rebecca prepare for college applications. When I graduated 3rd in my high school class, the family dinner afterward was cut short because Rebecca was going through a breakup and needed support. I learned that my victories were speed bumps in the family narrative while Rebecca's struggles were main plot points, requiring everyone's attention. The saddest part is that I internalized this treatment as normal. I told myself I was just more capable, more resilient, less needy than my sister. I wore my independence like armor, never acknowledging that it was actually a coping mechanism for chronic emotional neglect. I'd been trained so thoroughly that by the time I reached adulthood, I policed my own needs before anyone else had to. The pattern intensified as we grew older. When Rebecca's husband Jake lost his job 3 years ago, my father called me. Not to ask how I was doing, not to catch up, but to tell me that Rebecca was really struggling and ask if I could help out with their mortgage for a few months. I sent $8,300 over the next 6 months. The help was never framed as a loan, just family helping family. When Jake found new work, there was no discussion of repayment. The money had simply disappeared into the category of what Kimberly does. When my father had unexpected medical expenses 2 years ago, tests and procedures his insurance didn't fully cover, I sent $12,400. When Rebecca needed a new car after an accident, I co-signed her loan because her credit wasn't good enough. When my father got behind on taxes and faced penalties, I spent weeks organizing his paperwork and managing the payment plan with the IRS. Every single time the request came with the same underlying assumption: this is what Kimberly does. This is her role, her function. Not once in those years did anyone call to ask how I was doing. Not once did they ask if I was facing my own financial pressures, my own challenges, my own needs. They never asked about my work, my life, my dreams. They didn't ask because knowing would have complicated things. Acknowledging me as a full person with my own struggles and limitations would have made it harder to extract what they needed from me. I used to think they just didn't realize how one-sided our relationships had become. I thought they were simply thoughtless, caught up in their own problems, not malicious. But sitting with the evidence of the Christmas trip, the calculated timing, the deliberate exclusion, the casual cruelty of family only, I finally saw the truth. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This was optimization. They'd learned over decades exactly how to extract maximum value from me with minimum reciprocation. They'd learned I would absorb pain silently, provide resources without demanding accountability, and accept mistreatment without pushing back. They'd conditioned me to believe that endless sacrifice without recognition or reciprocity was what good daughters do, what family means. And the most damning realization of all, they'd never worried about pushing too far. They'd never feared that one day I might say no, might walk away, might demand to be treated with the same care they showed Rebecca. They'd never worried about losing me because they'd trained me so well that they genuinely believed I would never leave. They never worried about losing me because they'd spent 36 years training me to stay. But what they didn't realize was that their own arrogance would be what finally broke the pattern. 3 weeks after the family-only phone call, my father proved just how deeply he believed I would never push back. It was a Tuesday evening. I was making dinner when my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen, and for a brief moment, I considered not answering. But old habits die hard. I picked up. Kimberly. No greeting, no small talk. Just my name spoken with the clipped impatience of someone who has more important things to do. The refinance payment on the house is overdue. Did you send the money? I stood perfectly still in my kitchen wooden spoon in hand, trying to process what I'd just heard. There was no preamble, no acknowledgement that we'd spoken 3 weeks ago, that he'd told me they'd taken a $15,000 trip without me after I'd paid for it. No mention of family only, or any attempt to explain or apologize. He was calling as if nothing had happened, as if our relationship was exactly what it had always been, as if he had every right to expect my immediate compliance. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed to say. "The house payment. The refinance." His tone suggested I was being deliberately obtuse. "It was due last week. I need to know if you sent it or if I need to follow up with the bank." The sheer entitlement in his voice took my breath away. He was speaking to me the way someone speaks to an assistant who's failed to complete a routine task. There was no request in his words, no acknowledgement that he was asking for my money. Just an assumption that I'd already sent it or should have, and irritation that he now had to check. "Dad, I don't understand." "What refinance payment? I thought you owned the house outright. You told me years ago the mortgage was paid off." There was a pause. I could hear him exhale sharply, a sound of frustration. "It's complicated, Kimberly. We needed to refinance for financial planning purposes. The point is, the payment is due and I need to know if you handled it." I didn't know anything about a refinance. Why would I have sent money for something I didn't know about? "Because I'm telling you about it now." His voice had an edge now, that particular sharpness that appeared when he wasn't getting immediate compliance. "Look, I don't have time to explain the entire financial strategy. You wouldn't understand it anyway. The bottom line is we need $7,000 by Friday to avoid penalties." $7,000. spoken as casually as someone asking to borrow $20 for lunch. I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. This wasn't a request. This was a demand wrapped in the assumption that my money was his money, that my resources existed for his convenience. "Why do you need to refinance again?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "And why am I responsible for this payment?" Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to that particular manipulative warmth he used when irritation wasn't working. "Honey, you know your sister has her own family to support. Jake's income is barely covering their basics. You're the only one in a position to help. You're the only one I can count on." There it was, the familiar script. Rebecca's life with her husband and children was implicitly more valid, more demanding, more worthy of protection than mine. My life as a single child-free woman meant my money was more available, my time more disposable, my needs less legitimate. I was the one who could handle it, not because I was more capable, but because my life was seen as less important. "I need to see the documents first," I said. The words came out calm, measured. "I need to see the refinance paperwork, understand what this payment is for, and why it's necessary." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear my father breathing on the other end of the line, could feel the shift in energy even through the phone. When he spoke again, his voice wasn't warm anymore. It wasn't even irritated. It was cold with barely restrained anger. "You're really going to do this? Make me jump through hoops for help after everything we've done for you? Everything they'd done for me." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stayed quiet, waiting to see what he'd say next. "You know what your problem is, Kimberly? You've always been so rigid, so uptight about paperwork and procedures. This is family. You're supposed to help when family needs you. You don't demand documentation like we're strangers conducting business." And there it was. The accusation that my entirely reasonable request to understand what I was being asked to pay for made me difficult, made me cold, made me the problem. The demand that I prove my love through blind financial compliance. "I'm not sending money without understanding what it's for," I said quietly. "That's not negotiable." "Fine." The word was sharp-cutting. "I can see where we stand. I'll remember this when you need something from me." I wanted to point out that I had never needed anything from him, that our entire relationship was one-way extraction. But I didn't. I simply said, "Goodbye, Dad," and ended the call. I stood in my kitchen, phone in hand, and felt the ground shift beneath me. That call wasn't about a house payment. It was a test. He was checking whether the family-only incident had disrupted my conditioning, whether I'd absorbed the message and retreated into my usual compliant silence. My refusal to send money without questions wasn't treated as reasonable. It was treated as rebellion. That's when I realized they weren't asking for help. They were testing control. After that phone call, I sat down at my kitchen table and looked around my condo. Really looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, large windows that fill the space with natural light. I'd bought it 6 years ago and paid it off 3 years early through disciplined saving and strategic extra payments. The mortgage satisfaction letter is framed in my home office, not as a display of wealth, but as a reminder of what I'd accomplished entirely on my own. My family has never seen this place. They've never asked to visit. They don't know that I own it outright, that my monthly housing cost is just property taxes and HOA fees. They don't know that I have a retirement account worth more than most people my age, that I maintain excellent credit, that I live comfortably within my means while still having enough left over to help them, or at least I did until recently. I work as a financial analyst for HealthBridge Solutions, a mid-sized healthcare management company. I've been there for 8 years. I analyze cost structures, identify inefficiencies, and help medical facilities optimize their operations without compromising patient care. It's detailed work that requires precision and judgment. I'm good at it. My salary is $89,000 a year, plus bonuses that usually add another $10,000 to $15,000. I have comprehensive health insurance, a 401k match, and 3 weeks of vacation I actually use. My life isn't glamorous, but it's solid. I have friends, real friends who know me, who call just to talk, who remember my birthday without being reminded. I take painting classes on Thursday evenings. I volunteer at a literacy program on Saturday mornings. I travel when I want to, usually solo trips where I can move at my own pace and follow my own interests. I have a life that I've built deliberately, carefully, with intention and purpose. My family knows none of this. Not because I'm secretive, but because I learned years ago that sharing success with them only created problems. When I got my first major promotion 5 years ago, a 22% salary increase, and a new title, I made the mistake of telling my father during one of our rare phone conversations. I was excited. I thought maybe this time he'd be proud that he'd finally see me as something other than the practical daughter who existed to solve problems. His response: "That's great, honey. Listen, since you're doing so well now, do you think you could help me pay off my car loan? It's got a terrible interest rate, and I'd love to get it cleared before the end of the year." No congratulations. No questions about my new responsibilities or what the promotion meant for my career. Just an immediate calculation of what my success could provide for him. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before he'd extracted a promise of $6,800 to pay off his car. When I bought my condo 3 years ago, I mentioned it to Rebecca in passing. Her response wasn't congratulations either. She said, "Oh, 2 bedrooms. You should have gotten a 3-bedroom so when we visit we'd all have space. Or better yet, you should have bought a house with a guest suite. It would be so nice to have a place the family could use for vacations." She'd turned my achievement into a missed opportunity to serve the family better. Not once did she acknowledge what it meant for a single woman in her 30s to buy property on her own. Not once did she ask if I was happy, if I felt proud, if this was what I wanted. She only saw what I'd failed to provide for her comfort. After incidents like these, I stopped sharing. I stopped mentioning promotions or financial milestones. I stopped talking about my life at all. When my family called, which was only when they needed something, I kept conversations brief and vague. My success became invisible to them, not because they couldn't see it, but because I'd learned that visibility only made me a more attractive target for extraction. It was Diana who finally helped me understand what I'd been doing to myself. Diana Reeves is a senior director at my company, 62 years old, with the kind of calm authority that comes from hard-won wisdom. We'd worked together on several projects, and she'd apparently noticed things I thought I'd hidden well, the way I tensed when my phone rang during work hours, the family emergencies that periodically drained my bank account, the way I deflected compliments about my work by calling myself just lucky, or in the right place at the right time. One day, about 6 months before the Christmas trip incident, Diana invited me to coffee. We talked about work at first, but then she said something that changed the trajectory of my thinking. "Kimberly, I'm going to say something that might feel intrusive, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you want. But I see patterns in you that I recognize from my own past. You diminish yourself. You make yourself small. And I'm guessing you have family members who benefit greatly from your tendency to disappear." I was so shocked by her accuracy that I didn't know how to respond. She continued, her voice gentle but firm. "People who benefit from your silence will fight the hardest when you start to speak. And people who've never had to earn your presence won't understand when you withdraw it. They'll call you selfish. They'll tell you that you've changed. They'll accuse you of abandoning your responsibilities. But what they really mean is that you've stopped accepting mistreatment, and that threatens the system they've built around using you." Her words hit me like a physical force. I'd been complicit in my own erasure, hiding my life and my success to avoid being further exploited, never realizing that my silence only made the exploitation easier. By disappearing myself, I'd made it simple for them to pretend I didn't exist except when they needed something. I thanked Diana and left that coffee shop with a new understanding. I didn't speak up immediately. I didn't confront anyone or draw boundaries. Instead, I did something more valuable. I started watching. Really watching what my family was actually doing. Not what I wanted to believe they were doing. Watching meant documenting. And as a financial analyst, documentation is what I do best. The weekend after my father's demand for the house payment, I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop. I titled it simply Family Financial History and began populating it with data I'd been avoiding looking at as a whole for years. I went through 10 years of bank statements, credit card records, and email confirmations. Every transfer, every check, every emergency that had required my immediate financial intervention. I logged each one with dates, amounts, stated reasons, and whether repayment had ever been discussed or received. The process took me nearly 6 hours. When I finished, I sat back and stared at the total at the bottom of the column. $47,300. That's what I'd given my family over the past decade. The breakdown was stark. Rebecca's mortgage help when Jake lost his job, $8,300 over 6 months. My father's medical expenses, $12,400 for procedures his insurance didn't cover. The Christmas trip, $15,000. Rebecca's car loan co-signing that I'd had to cover when she missed 3 payments, $4,200. My father's tax penalties, $3,800. Emergency car repairs, insurance deductibles. The cost of flying home for a family emergency that turned out to be Rebecca needing someone to watch her kids while she went on a spa weekend. The list went on and on. Not $1 had ever been repaid. Not one conversation had included the word loan or any discussion of terms. Every request had been framed as temporary help, as family supporting family, as what people who love each other do. But the flow was entirely one direction. In those same 10 years, I couldn't identify a single instance where my family had helped me financially, offered assistance, without being asked or even inquired whether I needed anything. I added another column to the spreadsheet, family inquiries about my well-being. I scrolled through years of text messages, emails, and phone records. The column remained almost entirely empty. The few entries I could make were perfunctory birthday texts or brief questions about my health that were clearly preambles to requests for money. There was no genuine interest in my life, my career, my emotional state, or my struggles. The asymmetry was brutal when laid out in data. But it was the Christmas trip investigation that transformed my understanding from "I've been taken advantage of" to "I've been deliberately defrauded." I pulled up the original booking confirmation from the resort, the one I'd received in early October when I'd made the reservation. I'd saved it in a folder with all the other trip documents. The reservation was for 5 adults, my father Rebecca, her husband Jake, myself, and one additional guest I'd assumed was Rebecca's oldest child who'd just turned 18. Then I pulled up the final confirmation email the resort had sent me 2 weeks before the December 18th departure date, the date I'd believed we were all traveling. This email showed only 4 adults. I'd glanced at it when it arrived, assuming the change reflected a cancellation by Rebecca's son. I hadn't thought to question it because I'd trusted that any significant changes would have been communicated to me. Now looking at it with clear eyes, I noticed something I'd missed before. The email included a modification reference number and a note, "As requested, reservation modified on October 15th. October 15th, 1 week after I'd sent the first deposit of $7,500. I called the resort's customer service line. A young woman answered, cheerful and helpful. I explained I'd booked a reservation that had been modified, and I needed to understand the change history for my records. She asked for my confirmation number and placed me on hold. When she returned, her voice had shifted slightly, still professional, but cautious. "Ma'am, I see the modification was requested through the account holder's email, not yours. The request came in October 15th to remove 1 adult guest from the party while maintaining the same room configuration. Was any refund issued for the removed guest?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Another pause. "Yes, a partial refund of $2,847 was processed to the account holder's credit card on file. That would be a Mr. Thomas Martinez. Not to the credit card that made the original payment." "No, ma'am. The modification request specified that the refund should go to the account holder since he'd be managing all financial aspects of the trip going forward." She hesitated. "Is there a problem? Do you need to dispute something?" I thanked her and ended the call before she could ask more questions. I sat with my phone in my hand, absorbing what I'd just learned. My father had removed me from the reservation 1 week after I'd paid the first deposit. Not at the last minute. Not in response to some sudden change of plans. He'd done it immediately, while there was still time to adjust the booking, while I still believed I was part of the trip. He'd then pocketed nearly $3,000 that should have been refunded to me. When the resort sent me the final confirmation with the reduced guest count, he'd bet that I wouldn't notice or wouldn't question it. The December dates, the ones that coincided with the weekend, I'd told him I had a work presentation hadn't been chosen because of some sudden schedule conflict. They'd been chosen from the beginning. He'd known when I said I couldn't travel those dates that he'd found his window. The entire conversation in September about one last family Christmas had been theater. He'd never intended to include me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't thoughtlessness or poor communication or a last-minute change of plans. This was premeditated theft. He'd used my money to fund a trip I was never meant to attend, modified the reservation to exclude me while keeping my funds, and pocketed the refund he should have returned. The family-only comment wasn't a cruel dismissal. It was an admission, a confession hidden in plain sight. I'd been watching my family, trying to understand the patterns of dysfunction. What I'd found instead was something much simpler and much worse: calculation, planning, and fraud. They didn't forget to include me. They planned from the start to take my money and erase me from the story. The discovery that my father had stolen from me was clarifying, but it didn't answer the larger question forming in my mind. Why now? Why this particular trip, this particular timing, this particular deception? My father's demand for a house payment for a house he'd claimed to own outright kept nagging at me. There was something deeper happening, something I couldn't yet see. I decided to start where financial analysts always start, with public records. Property records, mortgage filings, and tax documents are all matters of public record in most states. I logged into the county assessor's website for the county where my father lives and pulled up the property information for the house I'd grown up in. The basic information was what I expected. The house was assessed at $340,000. Property taxes were current, and the deed showed my father as the sole owner following my mother's death in 2011. But when I looked at the mortgage history, something didn't add up. There was a mortgage origination from 2010, a $180,000 loan from Southwest Regional Bank. That struck me as odd, because I distinctly remembered my parents celebrating paying off their mortgage in the early 2000s. I'd been in high school. Why would they have taken out a new mortgage in 2010? I pulled the actual filing documents, which showed my father's signature on the loan. Only his signature. Not my mother's, even though they were married and the house should have required both signatures for any mortgage. I made a note of that discrepancy. Then I found a second mortgage filing from 2020, a refinance of $210,000 with a different lender, Desert Vista Credit Union. Again, only my father's signature. This was the refinance he'd mentioned years ago, the one I'd thought was just financial optimization. But looking at it now, the refinance amount was higher than the original 2010 mortgage, which meant instead of paying down the debt, he'd extracted more money from the house. If he'd refinanced in 2020 and the typical term was 30 years, why was he now, in 2024, demanding money for another refinance payment? The timeline didn't make sense. Monthly payments should be manageable for years, unless he'd defaulted. Unless something had gone very wrong with his finances that he wasn't telling me about. I sat back from my computer, frustrated by what I was seeing but not fully understanding. The financial picture was murky, deliberately so, but there had to be a reason my father needed money now and a reason he'd been so evasive about it. That's when I thought about the Christmas trip again. I pulled up the resort information, looking at it with fresh eyes. Scottsdale, Arizona. It had seemed like an odd choice at the time. My family was from Illinois, and Scottsdale wasn't exactly a traditional Christmas destination. But my father had insisted it was the perfect location, had sent me links to the resort's website with its elaborate holiday decorations and special events. On impulse, I searched for Scottsdale, Arizona estate attorney combined with my mother's name. The results were immediate and stunning. The law firm of Morrison & Associates, located in downtown Scottsdale, had handled my mother's estate probate in 2011. I recognized the name from documents I'd signed years ago. Standard paperwork for the distribution of her minimal assets, her personal belongings, a small savings account. Nothing significant. But why would that firm matter now? 13 years after my mother's death. I pulled up the Maricopa County Court System website and searched for probate hearings scheduled during the dates of the Christmas trip, December 11th through 14th. The public calendar showed multiple estate administration hearings, will contests, and property transfer proceedings scheduled that week. It's not uncommon the holidays are apparently a busy time for estate matters as people try to resolve things before the new year. I couldn't see specific case names without deeper access, but the pattern was becoming clear. Scottsdale wasn't chosen for its holiday charm. It was chosen because my father needed to be there for legal reasons, and a family vacation was the perfect cover story. He could conduct whatever business he needed to conduct meetings with attorneys, possibly court appearances, document signings, while appearing to everyone back home to be on a wholesome family trip. And if I'd been there, I would have asked questions. I would have noticed if we deviated from tourist activities. I would have wondered why we were meeting with lawyers. I would have asked to see documents to understand what was being discussed. My entire personality, the careful, analytical, documentation-obsessed personality my family had always dismissed as uptight, would have been a liability to whatever my father was trying to accomplish. The family-only comment suddenly made perfect sense in this context. It wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. He didn't want me there because I'm the one person in the family who doesn't accept vague explanations about finances. Rebecca would go along with whatever Dad said, would sign whatever papers he put in front of her without reading them, carefully would trust that he had everyone's best interests at heart. I wouldn't. The trip timing, the location, the deliberate exclusion, the stolen money, it all served a purpose. My father was conducting legal business related to the house, related to my mother's estate, related to something he desperately didn't want me to know about. And he'd used my money to fund his deception. I thought about his recent demand for refinance money, about his evasiveness, when I'd asked questions about his anger, when I'd refused to simply send funds without documentation. He wasn't just asking for money. He was trying to solve a problem I wasn't supposed to discover existed. The realization settled over me with cold certainty. They didn't leave me out because I wasn't family. They left me out because I asked questions they couldn't afford to answer. I spent 2 days processing what I'd discovered. The Scottsdale connection, the legal maneuvering hidden behind a family vacation, the calculated nature of my exclusion. I didn't reach out to my father or sister. I simply waited, watching to see what would happen next. The answer came on Thursday evening. My phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, preparing myself for another demand or deflection. "Kimberly, honey, it's Dad." His voice was completely different from our last conversation. Where before there had been impatience and barely controlled anger, now there was warmth, almost tenderness. "I know I was harsh with you on the phone last week. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize I was out of line." I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. "The truth is, I've been under tremendous stress. Health issues, financial pressures, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. You didn't deserve that." He paused, and I could hear what sounded like genuine emotion in his voice. "You're my daughter. You've always been there for this family, and I haven't always appreciated that the way I should." The performance was excellent. If I hadn't spent the last week discovering evidence of his deception, I might have believed it. As it was, I recognized this for what it was, a tactical shift. Direct demands hadn't worked, so now he was trying another approach. "I'd really like to sit down with you, just the two of us," he continued. "Have dinner, talk honestly about some family matters. Clear the air. Would you be willing to do that?" Every instinct told me this was manipulation. But I also knew that refusing would tell him I was pulling away, that I'd seen through something. So I agreed. Sure, Dad. When were you thinking, how about Saturday, that Italian place you like, Marcello's my treat? After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand thinking. Then I opened the voice recorder app and checked that it was working properly. I'd never recorded a conversation with a family member before, but I'd also never discovered evidence that a family member was actively defrauding me. I told myself this was just documentation, the same way I documented everything in my work. Facts, not emotion. Saturday arrived. I met my father at Marcello's, a mid-range Italian restaurant we'd been to a handful of times over the years for birthdays and graduations. He was already seated when I arrived, and he stood to hug me, something he rarely did. He held the hug a beat longer than normal, and I felt my body stiffen despite my attempt to appear relaxed. Over appetizers, he continued the warm, vulnerable performance. He talked about feeling overwhelmed by life, by aging, by the responsibilities of managing everything alone since my mother died. He asked about my work, not specific questions that would reveal he knew nothing about what I actually do, but general questions that could apply to any job. How are things at the office, still keeping busy? I gave equally vague answers. Things are good. Busy, but manageable. Then, as our entrees arrived, he shifted. The transition was smooth, almost imperceptible. You know, I've been thinking about what you said on the phone, about wanting to see documentation for the house refinance. You're absolutely right. You deserve to understand the family finances, especially since you've been so generous in helping out. I cut into my chicken, carefully saying nothing. The truth is, the house has become complicated. The refinancing, the payments, I'm trying to manage everything, but I'm 68 years old, and honestly I worry about what happens if something happens to me. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. So I have a proposal. If you can help me with this current refinance situation, and I'm not talking about a gift, we can structure it as a loan if you want. I'll add your name to the deed. You'll have a legal stake in the property. It's what your mother would have wanted. She always wanted to make sure both you girls were taken care of. It was a good offer. On the surface, it sounded fair, even generous. A chance to have actual ownership, legal protection assurance that I wouldn't just be contributing money into a void. If I'd been the person he thought I was trusting, eager for family connection, desperate for acknowledgement, I would have agreed immediately. But then he made his mistake. I know you've been so busy lately with work, he said, refilling my water glass in a gesture of attentiveness. That work trip you took to San Diego must have been exhausting. I remember you mentioning you barely had time to sleep. My hand froze for just a fraction of a second before I continued cutting my food. San Diego. I've never been to San Diego for work. I traveled to San Francisco 6 months ago for a conference. San Francisco, where my mother's original estate attorney is located. San Francisco, where probate records from 2011 would be filed. In that instant, I understood. This wasn't just a reconciliation dinner. This was reconnaissance. He was testing me, dropping false information to see if I'd correct it. If I said, Dad, it was San Francisco, not San Diego, he'd know I was paying careful attention to cities' locations details. He'd know I might be investigating, might have discovered the Scottsdale connection, or might be looking into estate records. But someone who'd genuinely been to San Diego for work would either agree or not notice the error. Someone who wasn't investigating wouldn't have any reason to be sensitive about the distinction between California cities. I smiled at him and said, Yeah, San Diego was really hectic. But it's over now, so I'm glad to have some breathing room. I watched his shoulders drop slightly, saw the tension leave his jaw. He thought he'd gotten his answer. He thought I wasn't investigating, that I was still the compliant daughter who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. We finished dinner. He paid as promised. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot, and he reminded me to think about the house proposal. I promised I would. In my car, I stopped the recording app on my phone. Nearly 90 minutes of conversation, all saved. Then I sat in the dimming evening light processing what had just happened. My father wasn't just trying to get money from me. He was actively monitoring whether I was becoming a threat to whatever he was trying to hide. He'd thrown out a test, the San Diego reference, and when I didn't correct it, he'd concluded I was safe, that I hadn't started digging into estate records or attorney locations. He wasn't apologizing. He was hunting for leaks, and I'd just learned to stop leaking. After the dinner with my father, I knew I needed more information. But I also knew that direct confrontation wouldn't work. He was too practiced at deflection and manipulation. What I needed was to understand the full scope of what was happening, and that meant talking to Rebecca. Not openly, not in a way that would get back to my father, but carefully. I knew Rebecca worked as an administrative assistant at a dental practice in Tempe. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the shopping center near her office and waited at a coffee shop I knew she sometimes visited during her lunch break. It took 2 days of this surveillance before I finally saw her walk in, and when she did, I made sure to look surprised. Rebecca. Oh my God, what are the chances? I stood up from my table, forcing a smile. She looked startled, then uncertain. Kimberly. Hi, I didn't know you came here. I don't usually. I had a meeting nearby and needed caffeine. The lie came easily. Do you have time to sit for a minute? I feel like we haven't really talked in forever. She hesitated long enough that I knew she wanted to refuse, but social convention won out. Sure, just for a few minutes though. I have to get back. We got our drinks and sat at a corner table. I kept my tone light casual. How are the kids? How's Jake? They're good. Everyone's good. Her answers were clipped automatic. She kept glancing at her phone, which sat face up on the table between us. I shifted the conversation carefully. I've been thinking lately about family stuff. About Mom, about Dad getting older. Do you ever worry about how he's managing everything on his own? Something flickered across her face. Anxiety, maybe, or guilt. He seems to be doing okay. Does he talk to you about finances, about the house? I asked it innocently, as if I were just making conversation. Sometimes. She picked up her phone, checked the screen, even though it hadn't buzzed. Why? He asked me for money recently, for some kind of refinance payment. It just seemed odd because I thought the house was paid off. I watched her face carefully. Did he mention anything to you about that? Rebecca's jaw tightened. Kimberly, Dad's finances are complicated. He's managing a lot. If he asked you for help, I'm sure he had good reasons. I'm sure he did. I just wish I understood what those reasons were. She set her coffee down too hard, liquid sloshing slightly over the rim. Look, I know you like to have everything explained and documented. That's just how you are. But sometimes you need to trust that family knows what's best. The edge in her voice was defensive, but there was something else underneath it. Fear, maybe. I decided to push just a little further. The Christmas trip, I said, keeping my voice gentle. I know I wasn't there, but how was it Dad said it was beautiful? Rebecca's face went pale. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Kimberly, just let this go. Please. Don't make things complicated. The way she said it, there was no cruelty in her tone, no dismissiveness, just fear. Raw, genuine fear. What do you mean, complicated, Rebecca? What's going on? She shook her head, gathering her purse. There are things you don't want to know. Trust me. Sometimes it's better to just keep things simple, for everyone. Rebecca, wait. But she was already standing. I have to get back to work. Take care of yourself, Kimberly. She walked out quickly, not looking back. I sat at that table for another 20 minutes replaying the conversation. Rebecca wasn't angry with me. She wasn't defending our father out of loyalty or spite. She was afraid. Afraid of something specific, something she thought would hurt me to know. Or maybe afraid for herself. That evening I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No area code I recognized. The message was brief. Check Mom's safety deposit box at First National. You're on the access list. Dad doesn't know. My heart started pounding. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood. Then I tried calling the number. It rang once and went to a generic voicemail message. No name, no personalization. I hung up and tried texting back. Who is this? The message didn't deliver. A red exclamation point appeared next to it, indicating the number was disconnected or the message was blocked. I checked the timestamp, 9:47 p.m. I looked up First National Bank. There was a branch not far from where I'd grown up, the bank my parents had used for decades. I had vague memories of going there with my mother when I was young, of waiting in the lobby while she conducted business at the counter. A safety deposit box. I didn't know my mother had one, or if I had once known, I'd forgotten in the 13 years since she died. But someone knew. Someone knew I was on the access list. Someone knew my father didn't want me to find it. The message had come less than 6 hours after my coffee shop conversation with Rebecca. It could be coincidence, or it could be that Rebecca, too frightened to help me directly, had found another way. I looked at my phone again at that single cryptic message. Someone in my family, I was nearly certain it was Rebecca, wanted me to know the truth. But they were too afraid to be seen helping me find it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept looking at the anonymous message, kept thinking about Rebecca's warning to let this go, kept wondering what my mother could have possibly left in a safety deposit box that my father didn't want me to find. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I almost never do, and drove to First National Bank. The branch was the same one from my childhood, though it had been remodeled since then. Modern and sleek where it used to be warm and traditional. I approached the customer service desk, my heart pounding in a way that felt disproportionate to the simple act of asking a question. I received information that my mother may have had a safety deposit box here. Her name was Elena Martinez. She passed away in 2011. The woman at the desk, whose nameplate read Sandra Chen, gave me a sympathetic look. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me check our records." She typed into her computer, her expression shifting to something more alert. "Yes, we do have a box registered under that name, and it looks like—" She paused, reading the screen more carefully. "You're listed as a joint holder on the account." "I'm what?" "A joint holder. Your mother added you to the access list in 2009. That means you have full rights to access the box without any special permissions or court orders." I felt dizzy. "I didn't know that. She never told me." Sandra's expression was kind. "That happens more often than you'd think. People set these things up as insurance, as backup plans, and sometimes they don't mention it because they hope it won't be necessary." She stood up. "Do you have identification? I'll take you to the vault." I followed her through a heavy door into a climate-controlled room lined with small metal boxes. She used her key and had me sign in, then directed me to box 247. My hands shook slightly as I turned my key in the lock and pulled out the long metal container. "You can use the private room over there," Sandra said, pointing to a small windowed room. "Take your time." I carried the box to the room and sat down at the small table. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Whatever was inside, my mother had wanted me to find it, had made sure I could find it, but she'd never told me it existed. I lifted the lid. Inside was a single manila envelope, the kind lawyers use for documents. Written across the front in my mother's handwriting, "For Kimberly, if you're reading this, something went wrong." My eyes blurred with tears before I even opened it. I took a steadying breath and unsealed the envelope. The first item was a handwritten will on legal paper dated November 15th, 2009. I recognized my mother's precise handwriting immediately. The language was formal but clear. "I, Elena Rose Martinez, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament. The house located at 4782 Sycamore Drive was purchased in 2003 using inheritance money from my mother's estate, not marital income. It is my wish that this property be given to my daughter Kimberly Martinez upon my death. She is the practical one, the strong one, and she will need this security. Thomas has proven he cannot be trusted with financial matters." I read that last line 3 times. My mother had written in her own hand that my father couldn't be trusted. The second item was a letter 3 pages written on the same legal paper dated March 2010. "My dearest Kimberly," it began. If you're reading this, it means your father has continued down a path I tried to stop him from taking. I need you to know the truth about what happened, about what I discovered, about what I tried to prevent." The letter explained that in February 2010, my mother had noticed irregularities in their bank statements. When she investigated, she discovered my father had taken out a mortgage on the house, their house, the one they'd supposedly owned free and clear, without her knowledge or consent. He'd forged her signature on the documents, or found a way to exclude her from the process, taking advantage of a technicality in how the deed was filed. "I confronted him," she wrote. "He claimed it was a temporary measure, that he'd made some bad investments and needed to cover losses before I noticed. He promised to pay it back quickly. But I knew he was lying, knew this was deeper than he was admitting. I told him I wanted a separation. I wanted to protect you girls, especially you, because I knew he would try to use you the way he'd used me." My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't hold the letter. I intended to file for separation and update my will through proper legal channels. The letter continued. "But then I got sick. The cancer came so fast, Kimberly. By the time we knew how serious it was, I was too weak to fight him in court. So I did what I could. I wrote this will in my own hand. I put copies of the bank records here, and I made sure you were on the access list for this box. If you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong with the official estate. It means your father has found a way to cheat you out of what I tried to leave you. Don't let him erase what I tried to protect. The house should be yours. It was always meant to be yours." The letter ended with, "I love you, my practical girl. Be strong." The third item in the envelope was a stack of bank records from 2010 showing the mortgage origination from Southwest Regional Bank. $180,000. Only my father's signature on the documents, despite the fact that the house was marital property. I sat in that small room holding papers my mother had hidden away 13 years ago and understood. She'd discovered his betrayal. She'd tried to leave him. But cancer had stolen her strength, her time, her ability to protect me through official channels. So she'd done this, created a paper trail, written her wishes in her own hand, and made sure I could find it if I needed to. My mother had spent her final year while dying trying to save me from the man who'd betrayed her. And my father had spent the 13 years since her death making sure I never found out. I left the bank that day with copies of everything. Sandra had allowed me to use the bank's copy machine, and I'd stood there for 20 minutes methodically duplicating every page, the handwritten will, the 3-page letter, the bank records showing the fraudulent mortgage. Before leaving the vault, I'd also photographed everything with my phone, making sure each image was clear and readable. But I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to an office supply store and made 3 more complete sets of copies. One set I stored in a fireproof safe in my condo. Another I put in a sealed envelope and gave to my friend Diana at work, asking her to keep it secure without asking questions. The third set I placed in a new safety deposit box at a different bank, entirely one my father had no connection to. Only then did I allow myself to feel the weight of what I'd discovered. I went home, locked my door, and cried for 2 hours straight for my mother, for the betrayal she'd endured, for the years I'd wasted trying to earn love from a man who'd proven himself incapable of giving it. But by the next morning, grief had crystallized into something else. Clarity. Purpose. My mother had spent her dying year trying to protect me. The least I could do was honor that sacrifice by using every skill I possessed to expose what my father had done. I opened a new spreadsheet, this one far more comprehensive than my previous financial tracking. I created a timeline starting from 2003, when my parents had bought the house, extending to the present. I noted every significant event: my mother's inheritance that purchased the house, the 2010 secret mortgage, my mother's cancer diagnosis in 2008, her death in 2011, the probate that followed. I cross-referenced dates from the bank records my mother had saved with public property records. I documented the 2020 refinance. I noted the Christmas trip and the Scottsdale legal meetings. Then I compiled every piece of evidence I had about my financial relationship with my family. The $47,000 I'd given them over a decade. The Christmas trip payment and the refund my father had pocketed. The recent demand for refinance money. Every text message, every email, every wire transfer confirmation. I wasn't just documenting the house issue, I was documenting a pattern of financial exploitation. It took me 3 weeks of working every evening and most weekends to assemble everything into a coherent narrative. The result was a 40-page document with appendices of supporting evidence. It read like the financial analysis reports I created at work, clear, factual, unemotional, and devastating in its thoroughness. Once I had the documentation organized, I scheduled a consultation with an estate attorney. I researched carefully, looking for someone who specialized in will contests and probate disputes. I found Margaret Chen, a 58-year-old attorney whose firm's website showed extensive experience in complex estate litigation. Her consultation fee was $450 for 2 hours. I booked it immediately. Margaret's office was in a modern building downtown, professionally decorated, but not ostentatious. She was exactly as I'd hoped, direct, sharp-eyed, and genuinely interested as I laid out my evidence across her conference table. She spent an hour reviewing everything without speaking, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Finally, she sat back and looked at me. "This is a strong case," she said. "The handwritten will is legally valid under Arizona law if we can establish your mother's intent and mental capacity at the time of writing. The letter helps significantly. It shows clear understanding of what she was doing and why. The bank records prove your father had already betrayed her trust before she wrote the will, which supports her reasoning." "But," I asked, hearing the hesitation in her voice, "but your father filed a different will for probate in 2011, presumably one that was notarized. That gives it presumptive validity. We'll need to prove either that the notarized will was forged or fraudulently obtained, or that your mother's handwritten will superseded it through clear testamentary intent. It's absolutely possible, but it won't be easy or quick. We're talking about reopening a probate case that's been closed for 13 years. She paused, studying me carefully. "The other question is, are you prepared for what this will do to your family? Your father will fight this. Your sister will likely side with him, at least publicly. You'll be accused of being greedy, of dishonoring your mother's memory, of tearing the family apart. Can you handle that?" I thought about the family-only comment, about $15,000 stolen, about my mother's letter and her final wish. "My family was torn apart a long time ago," I said. "I'm just finally acknowledging it." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about strategy. But before we file anything, I strongly recommend you separate yourself financially from your family. Close any joint accounts. Remove yourself from anything where they have access to your information. This is going to get adversarial, and you don't want them to have any leverage." I spent the following week executing her advice with the same methodical precision I'd applied to documentation. I called my father's bank and removed myself as an emergency contact on his accounts, a designation I hadn't even known I had until I asked. I terminated the credit card I'd given Rebecca for emergencies, which she'd used regularly without ever paying down the balance. I updated my mailing address on all financial documents to a P.O. box. I created a new email address specifically for legal correspondence, one my family couldn't access. I didn't announce these changes. I simply made them. When my father called 3 days later asking about something minor, I kept the conversation brief. When Rebecca texted asking if I could watch her kids next weekend, I replied that I was unavailable without explanation. They could feel something shifting, I'm sure. Phone calls that used to be answered immediately now went to voicemail. Requests that used to receive automatic compliance now received polite refusals. But they didn't understand yet what was happening. They thought I was pulling back emotionally. They had no idea I was preparing for war. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was building a case, and they had no idea the ground beneath them was already shifting. 2 weeks after my financial separation was complete, my father called with an invitation that caught me off guard. "Kimberly, I'm organizing a family meeting. Nothing heavy, just want to get everyone together to discuss some estate planning. Make sure everything is in order, for when I'm gone. Can you come Sunday afternoon? The request sounded reasonable, even responsible. The kind of thing families should do. I agreed, curious to see what he was planning. Sunday arrived and I drove to the house I'd grown up in, the house that, according to my mother's hidden will, should rightfully be mine. Walking up the driveway felt surreal, knowing what I now knew about the property's history, about the mortgage my father had fraudulently taken out, about my mother's desperate attempt to secure it for me. Inside, I was surprised to find not just my father and Rebecca, but extended family I rarely saw. Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark, my father's siblings, 2 of my cousins. Even Mrs. Grayson from next door, who'd been friends with my mother. The living room was arranged with folding chairs, and my mother's photos were everywhere on the mantel, on side tables, large framed prints I'd never seen displayed so prominently before. My father greeted everyone warmly, playing the role of devoted family patriarch. When everyone was settled, he stood at the front of the room, hands clasped in front of him. "Thank you all for coming. I know Sundays are precious, and I appreciate you making time for this." His voice was thick with emotion. "As I get older, I've been thinking a lot about Elena, about what she would want for this family, for this house she loved so much. I want to make sure everything is handled properly, that there's no confusion or conflict when I'm gone." Several people nodded. Aunt Linda dabbed at her eyes. The performance was masterful. "This house holds so many memories," he continued, gesturing around the room. "Your mother, Kimberly, and Rebecca, she poured her heart into making this a home. I feel a responsibility to be a good steward of that legacy, to make sure it's protected for the next generation." He spoke for 10 minutes about family, about legacy, about his age and health, about wanting to do right by everyone. It was moving. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have been genuinely touched. Then he shifted gears. "Now I've been working with my attorney to formalize some estate documents. Nothing complicated, just making sure everything is clear and legal. Part of that process involves making sure you girls understand the plan and agree to it." He picked up a stack of papers from the coffee table. "These are simple acknowledgement forms. They just confirm that you understand how the estate is structured and that you agree to the terms. It prevents any confusion or legal complications down the road." He handed a set of papers to Rebecca first. Rebecca's already reviewed hers and signed. He held up her copy, her signature visible on the last page. Then he handed a set to me. The document was several pages long, dense with legal language. The header read, "Release of Claims and Estate Acknowledgement Agreement." I glanced at the first page, standard estate planning language about understanding the testamentary wishes of Thomas Martinez, acknowledging receipt of information about the estate plan. My father was still talking, his tone casual and reassuring. "It's just a formality, really. My attorney said it's standard practice for estate planning. Makes everything cleaner when the time comes. No one wants family fighting over things after I'm gone, especially not in court." Several relatives murmured agreement. Aunt Linda said something about how smart it was to plan ahead. The social pressure in the room was palpable sign the papers be a good daughter. Show you're not the difficult one. I felt my father's eyes on me. Rebecca was watching too, her expression anxious. Everyone was waiting. My hand moved toward the pen he'd placed on the table. Then I turned to page 3, and a phrase jumped out at me. Waiver of claims in perpetuity. My analyst training, the years of reading financial documents, made me stop. That phrase didn't belong in a simple acknowledgement form. I read more carefully, scanning through the legal jargon. Section 3, paragraph 4. Signatory hereby irrevocably waives any and all claims present or future to contest any wills, trusts, property transfers, or estate distributions made by Thomas Martinez, and agrees to release any claims to inheritance or property rights that may arise from the estate of Elena Martinez, deceased. My heart started pounding. This wasn't an acknowledgement form. This was a complete waiver of my right to contest anything related to my mother's estate. If I signed this, I would have no legal standing to challenge the probate to present my mother's handwritten will to claim the house she'd left me. Rebecca had signed this. She'd given away her rights without reading what she was signing. "Dad," I said, my voice calm despite my racing pulse. "I need to read this more carefully. Can I take it home and review it?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. My father's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Honey, it's just a formality. There's nothing complicated about it. Everyone's waiting." "Then they can wait 5 more minutes while I read what I'm being asked to sign." I pulled the document closer, reading each section carefully. I could feel the discomfort spreading through the room. Aunt Linda shifted in her chair. My father's jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching near his temple. The more I read, the clearer it became. This document would forfeit every legal right I had. It was crafted specifically to prevent what I was planning to do, challenge the probate, present my mother's will, claim what she'd left me. He knew. Somehow he knew I'd found something. Maybe Rebecca had told him about our coffee shop conversation. Maybe he'd sensed my withdrawal over the past weeks. Or maybe he was just covering all bases, trying to lock me into compliance before I could become a threat. I set the pen down without signing. "I can't sign this without having my attorney review it first." The room went completely silent. My father's face transformed for just a split second. The warm, caring mask fell away completely, and I saw cold, calculated fury. Then he recovered, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your attorney," he said, his voice deceptively light. "Since when do you need an attorney to sign family documents, Kimberly?" "Since the documents involve legal waivers," I said. "This isn't just an acknowledgement form, Dad. It's a release of inheritance claims. I'm not signing away legal rights without proper counsel." Aunt Linda looked confused. "What do you mean, release of claims, Thomas? You said this was just paperwork." My father's face flushed. "It's standard estate planning language. Kimberly's being unnecessarily suspicious." "Standard language includes waiving rights to contest property transfers in perpetuity," I asked quietly. The room erupted in murmurs. My father tried to maintain control, but the damage was done. People were now looking at their own copies of what Rebecca had signed, seeing phrases they didn't understand, but recognized as significant. I stood up, gathering my unsigned papers. "I need to leave. I'll have my attorney review this and get back to you." I walked out, leaving behind a room full of confused relatives and one very angry father. I'd protected myself from signing away my rights. But I'd made a critical mistake. I'd revealed that I had an attorney. I'd shown my hand before I was ready to play it. I thought refusing to sign would protect me. I didn't realize I'd just revealed that I had an attorney, and that changed everything. I drove straight from the family meeting to my condo, the unsigned release form on my passenger seat, like evidence of a crime. I didn't wait until morning. I called Margaret's emergency line at 7 p.m., something I'd been told to use only if absolutely necessary. She answered on the 3rd ring. I explained what had happened, the family meeting, the release form disguised as estate planning documents. Rebecca's signature already obtained the legal language designed to strip away my rights. "Can you be at my office at 8 tomorrow morning?" Margaret asked. "Bring the document." "I'll be there." Margaret was already in her conference room when I arrived, coffee brewing, legal pads ready. I handed her the release form, and she read it in silence for 5 minutes, her expression growing darker with each page. Finally, she set it down and looked at me. "This is a litigation hold disguised as estate planning. Your father knows something is coming. He either suspects you found evidence or he's covering all possible angles. This document would have completely barred you from using anything you've discovered. If you'd signed this, your mother's will, her letter, the bank records, all of it would have been legally irrelevant." "Rebecca signed it," I said quietly. "Then Rebecca has forfeited her ability to challenge anything related to the estate. She can't help you now, even if she wanted to." Margaret leaned forward. "Kimberly, we're past the point of waiting and watching. Your father is actively moving to protect himself. If we don't act now, he'll have time to transfer assets, create more legal barriers, maybe even destroy evidence. We need to file immediately." The word file made everything real. File what exactly? A petition to reopen your mother's probate case based on newly discovered evidence. We'll argue that the 2011 probate was conducted based on incomplete or potentially fraudulent information, and that your mother's handwritten will represent her true testamentary intent. I felt my chest tighten. That means suing my father. Yes, that's exactly what it means. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. You need to understand what you're about to do. You're going to court to challenge your father's ownership of the family home. You're going to accuse him at minimum of financial impropriety and potentially of fraud. He will fight this with everything he has. He'll hire attorneys, he'll paint you as greedy and vindictive. He'll tell everyone you're trying to steal from him after all he's done for you. Your extended family, the people who were at that meeting yesterday, they'll take sides. Most of them will side with him because that's easier than believing he's been lying for 13 years. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This isn't about money. The house is worth maybe $340,000. After legal fees, taxes, even if you win, you're not getting rich. What you're really fighting for is truth, justice for your mother, and the principle that theft and deception shouldn't stand unchallenged just because they're committed by family. But that truth will cost you relationships, peace, possibly years of your life in legal proceedings. So I need to ask you directly, are you prepared for that? I thought about my mother's letter, her final words written while she was dying. Be strong, she'd said. I thought about 15 years of being used of family only, of $47,000 given and never acknowledged. I thought about the relief I'd felt over the past weeks as I'd distanced myself from people who'd never valued me. I'm prepared, I said. File it. Margaret nodded slowly as if she'd been expecting this answer but needed to hear me say it. Then let's talk strategy. We're going to file a comprehensive petition that accomplishes several things simultaneously. She pulled out a legal pad and began outlining. First, we petition to set aside the 2011 probate order. We'll argue it was based on either a forged will or a will obtained under duress while your mother was terminally ill. We have her handwritten will dated November 2009, which predates her cancer diagnosis becoming critical and which explicitly contradicts the will your father submitted. What if his will is legitimate? I asked. What if she did sign it? Then we argue that her subsequent handwritten will supersede it. We have her letter explaining her reasoning, which demonstrates clear testamentary capacity and intent. The handwritten will might be less formal, but in Arizona, handwritten wills are legally valid if they meet certain requirements, which yours does. She continued. Second, we're requesting an investigation into the 2010 mortgage. Your mother's records show it was taken without her knowledge or consent. That's potentially fraud, possibly financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult given her cancer diagnosis. Even if we can't prove criminal fraud due to statute of limitations, we can establish a pattern of financial deception that supports your mother's decision to exclude him from inheriting the house. Third, she said, we're filing for an immediate injunction preventing your father from selling, transferring, or further encumbering the property until the case is resolved. He cannot be allowed to liquidate the asset we're fighting over. How long will this take? I asked. Realistically, 12 to 18 months if we're lucky. Could be longer if your father fights aggressively, which he will. Estate litigation is never fast. She looked at me seriously. This is going to be expensive, emotionally draining, and publicly messy. But based on the evidence you've gathered, I believe we can win. I thought about my mother spending her final year trying to protect me, writing those letters with hands weakened by chemotherapy, hiding documents in a safety deposit box, because she knew her husband couldn't be trusted. Then let's do it, I said. File everything. Margaret began drafting. To save my mother's legacy, I had to do what she never got the chance to do, stand up to him in court. Margaret told me the legal filing would take approximately 1 week to prepare. During that week, while she drafted the comprehensive petition, I received a surprising notification on my phone, a Facebook event invitation from my father. Celebrating Elena a memorial gathering for what would have been her 70th birthday. The event was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the family house. The invitation was public, shared broadly across his social network. The description read, "Join us in honoring the memory of Elena Martinez, beloved wife, mother, and friend. Light refreshments, shared memories, and celebrating a life well lived." I stared at the invitation, my stomach turning. My mother's birthday was indeed approaching, she would have been 70. But my father had never organized anything like this before. Not on her 60th birthday anniversary, not on the 10th anniversary of her death. Why now? Then I understood. He knew legal action was coming. Maybe he'd guessed from my refusal to sign his release form, maybe Rebecca had told him about our conversation, or maybe he simply sensed the walls closing in. This memorial event was strategic positioning, creating a public narrative before I could file the lawsuit. I showed the invitation to Margaret during our next meeting. She nodded grimly. Classic pre-litigation strategy. He's establishing himself as the devoted, grieving widower who honors his wife's memory. When you file against him, people will remember this event and think you're attacking a man who clearly loved his wife. "Should I not go?" I asked. "Oh, you should absolutely go, and you should document everything." Saturday arrived. I drove to the house that had once been my home and was now the center of a legal battle that hadn't yet become public. The street was lined with cars. Inside, dozens of people filled the living room, the dining room spilling into the backyard. I recognized neighbors' people from my mother's church, my father's friends, relatives I hadn't seen in years. My father had created a memorial display on one wall, photos of my mother spanning her entire life. Her wedding day holding newborn Rebecca, teaching me to ride a bike at various family gatherings. The photos were beautiful, carefully selected to tell a story of a happy family and a devoted marriage. People approached me immediately. "Kimberly, it's so wonderful that your father organized this. He loved your mother so much. You must be so proud to have a father who honors her memory this way." I smiled and nodded, the cognitive dissonance making me feel physically ill. These people had no idea that the man they were praising had stolen from his dying wife, had hidden her final wishes, had spent 13 years benefiting from fraud. At 3 o'clock, my father called everyone together. He stood in front of my mother's photo wall, and his performance was masterful. His voice broke as he talked about meeting her 42 years ago, about their early years together, about watching her fight cancer with dignity and courage. "Elena wanted so many things for this family," he said, his eyes glistening. "She wanted us to stay close, to support each other, to remember what really matters. She was the glue that held us together. And even though she's been gone 13 years, I try every day to honor what she would have wanted." He talked about both of his daughters. When he got to me, he said, "Kimberly, you're so much like your mother. Strong, independent, practical. She used to say you were the one who didn't need anyone's help, who could handle anything life threw at you. She was so proud of the woman you became." Several people turned to look at me, smiling warmly. Someone patted my shoulder. Another woman wiped tears from her eyes. My father was painting me as the beloved daughter of a beloved wife, setting up a narrative where any legal action I took would seem like betrayal. I felt trapped in a performance I hadn't agreed to participate in, but I stayed, smiled, accepted condolences and compliments, and waited. Near the end of the event, as people were beginning to leave, an older woman approached me. I recognized her vaguely, Eleanor Vasquez, someone my mother had known from church. I hadn't seen her since my mother's funeral. "Kimberly," she said quietly, "could we speak privately for a moment?" We stepped into the backyard, away from the remaining guests. Eleanor's expression was serious, almost nervous. "I need to tell you something your mother asked me to tell you if certain circumstances arose." My heart started pounding. "What circumstances?" "She said if anything ever seemed wrong with how your father was handling her estate, if you ever had questions about her will or the house, I should tell you this: trust what she wrote in her own hand, not what anyone else claimed she wanted." I felt tears spring to my eyes. "She told you that—" "She came to me about 3 months before she died. She was very sick by then, but her mind was completely clear. She was worried, Kimberly. Worried about your father and what he might do after she was gone. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, worn and faded. She gave me this to keep safe. She said if you ever needed it, I should make sure you got it. She made me promise. I took the notebook with shaking hands. The cover was pale blue, the kind sold in drugstores. My mother's handwriting filled the page's journal entries from her final months. I've kept it all these years, Eleanor said. After your father organized this event, something told me it was time. Your mother loved you so much, Kimberly. She tried to protect you. I hope this helps. Eleanor hugged me briefly and walked back inside, leaving me alone in the backyard with my mother's journal. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. Instead, I tucked it carefully into my purse and watched through the window as my father continued to work, the room shaking hands, accepting sympathies, building his public defense brick by brick. My father built his defense in public, but he forgot my mother had cultivated allies he knew nothing about. I spent the 3 days after the memorial event reading my mother's journal. The entries were heartbreaking: her growing suspicion of my father's financial deception, her discovery of the secret mortgage, her confrontation with him, her deteriorating health that prevented her from taking legal action. On every page, I saw her trying to protect me while her body failed her. Margaret had finalized the legal petition. We'd scheduled the filing for Friday morning. The court would serve my father by Monday. I was prepared for what was coming, or at least I thought I was. Then my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. on Thursday night. I was half asleep when I grabbed it, saw Rebecca's name on the screen. My first thought was emergency: one of her kids hurt her husband in an accident. I answered immediately. Kimberly? Her voice was wrecked with crying, not the performative tears I'd seen from her before, but raw, desperate sobbing. Rebecca, what's wrong? Are the kids okay? The kids are fine, it's... She broke off, crying harder. I know what you're planning to do. Dad knows too. Kimberly, please, you have to stop. You don't understand what will happen. I sat up fully, my heart pounding. Then help me understand. There was a long silence, broken only by her ragged breathing. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, defeated. I need to tell you something. About why I've been helping him. About why I signed that release form without reading it. I'm listening. 7 years ago, I developed a shopping problem. I know that sounds stupid, like something from a TV movie, but it was real. Online shopping, mostly. I'd buy things we didn't need. Things I didn't even want, really. It was compulsive. I maxed out 3 credit cards, took out personal loans to cover the minimums on those cards, then took out more loans to cover those payments. It spiraled. I said nothing, letting her continue. Jake didn't know how bad it was until the divorce papers came. I'd been hiding the debt, but one of the creditors sued me and he found out. He was furious. He filed for separation and threatened to fight for full custody, said I was financially unstable and the kids weren't safe with me. I was facing bankruptcy and losing my children. Her voice cracked. Dad bailed me out. $89,000. He paid off everything: the cards, the loans, the legal fees, to keep Jake from taking the kids. He saved me, Kimberly, but he made me sign paperwork. Loan documents acknowledging I owed him the money personally, with interest. Rebecca, I can never pay it back. Ever. We both knew that when I signed. Jake and I worked things out, stayed married, but there's no way I could ever come up with $90,000. And Dad has reminded me of that every single time I've ever questioned him about anything. I felt my chest tighten. So when he needed you to help exclude me from the Christmas trip, he told me if I didn't cooperate, he'd demand immediate repayment. Call in the whole debt. I'd have to declare bankruptcy, and this time Jake wouldn't stay. I'd lose custody. The kids would suffer for my mistakes. She was sobbing again. I'm not proud of what I did, but I was trapped. I am trapped. I closed my eyes, processing this. And the release form at the family meeting. Same thing. He said sign it or he calls in the debt. I didn't even read it, Kimberly. I just signed because I was terrified. Why are you telling me this now? Because Dad knows you're going to sue him. I don't know how he knows, but he does. And he's desperate. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. That refinance money he asked you for, it wasn't for the house. The house refinance is fine. He borrowed money from some kind of loan shark to cover gambling debts, online poker sports betting. He's been doing it for years and it's gotten worse. He's drained the equity from the house to pay off previous gambling debts, and now he's in even deeper. I felt ice in my veins. Gambling debts. He needed your money to pay off this loan shark guy before things got dangerous. That's why he was so angry when you refused. That's why he's been acting increasingly desperate. When he couldn't get money from you, he turned back to me, but I'm already tapped out. I have nothing left to give him. She took a shaky breath. If you sue him, if you take the house in court, he'll have nothing left. He'll lose everything. And Kimberly, if he goes down, he'll take me with him. He's already told me that if this lawsuit happens, he's calling in my debt immediately. He'll make sure everyone knows I'm the one who helped him. He'll destroy me to save himself. So you're calling to ask me not to file the lawsuit. I'm calling to beg you. Please. My kids don't deserve to lose their home, their stability, because their mom made mistakes 7 years ago. I know I've been a terrible sister. I know I helped him hurt you. But please, Kimberly, don't do this. I thought about everything I'd discovered. About my mother's will, her letter, her desperate attempt to protect me. I thought about 15 years of being used of family only, of the refinance money that wasn't even for what he'd claimed. Rebecca, I said quietly, he's been making me lose everything my whole life. He stole my inheritance. He stole from our dying mother. He's used both of us in different ways, you through debt, me through guilt. And you're asking me to let it continue so that your kids don't suffer for choices you and Dad made. They're innocent children, Kimberly. And I was an innocent daughter who deserved better than being erased from her own family after paying for their vacation. I was an innocent daughter whose mother tried to leave her a house and whose father stole it. My voice was steady, but my heart was breaking. I'm sorry for what's going to happen to you. I really am. But I'm done protecting people who won't protect themselves or me. So you're going through with it? It wasn't a question. Yes. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was hollow. Then I guess there's nothing else to say. Goodbye, Kimberly. She hung up before I could respond. I sat in my dark bedroom, phone in hand, and understood something painful but necessary. My sister wasn't his accomplice by choice. She was his hostage. But I couldn't save someone who wouldn't first save herself. After Rebecca's call, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed watching the darkness gradually lighten into dawn, thinking about hostages and blackmail, about the different ways my father had trapped both of his daughters. By the time morning came, my resolve hadn't wavered. If anything, Rebecca's confession had only reinforced what I already knew. My father's pattern of financial manipulation ran deep, and it wouldn't stop until someone forced it to stop. At 9 a.m. Friday morning, I met Margaret at the courthouse. She carried a thick folder containing our petition, 83 pages of carefully documented evidence, legal arguments, and exhibits that laid out 13 years of deception in meticulous detail. "Are you sure about the filing date?" Margaret asked one final time. "February 14th. I confirmed. The day he proposed to my mother 42 years ago. I want the date on record." She nodded and submitted the filing. The clerk stamped it, received assigned a case number, and scheduled an initial hearing for April 15th, 2024. We were officially in litigation. The petition included 3 distinct causes of action. First, a challenge to the validity of the 2011 notarized will, arguing that the circumstances surrounding its creation and submission were suspicious given the timing of my mother's death and my father's known financial deception. Second, a petition to admit my mother's handwritten will as evidence of her true testamentary intent, supported by her letter, her journal entries, and Eleanor's testimony about her final wishes. Third, a request for the court to investigate whether my father's actions constituted fraud, financial abuse, or elder exploitation. The exhibits told a story that was impossible to dismiss: photographs of my mother's handwritten will, her 3-page letter explaining the betrayal access records showing she'd added me to the safety deposit box in 2009, bank records documenting the unauthorized 2010 mortgage property records, showing the subsequent refinances, and a comprehensive timeline connecting everything together. Margaret had also included my mother's journal, the one Eleanor had kept safe for 13 years, as evidence of her mental state and her explicit concerns about my father's trustworthiness. The court required my father to be served by a sheriff's deputy. That happened on Saturday afternoon. I know because my phone rang at 3:47 p.m. with his call. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Dad." "You bitch." His voice was stripped of all pretense, all performance. Pure, undiluted rage. "You actually did it. You actually sued me. Your own father." "Yes," I said calmly. "I did. After everything I've done for you. After I raised you, provided for you, gave you a home. You're going to destroy this family over a house. You're going to humiliate me in court, drag our private matters in front of strangers, air family business for everyone to see. You destroyed this family when you stole from your dying wife," I said. "I'm just making sure people know the truth." "The truth?" He laughed bitterly. "You think you know the truth? You think some letters your mother wrote while she was sick mean anything?" She was confused, Kimberly. The cancer affected her mind. She didn't know what she was doing. Her journal entries are very clear. Her letter is very clear. And her doctor will testify that she was completely competent when she wrote them. "You're going to lose." His voice turned vicious. "You're going to spend thousands on lawyers, humiliate yourself in court, and you're going to lose. And when this is over, you'll have no family left. Rebecca will never speak to you again. Your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, they all know what you're doing. They know you're trying to steal from me. No one will want anything to do with you." I felt remarkably calm. Family-only Dad. Remember? The silence that followed was electric. Then he screamed, "You ungrateful!" But I ended the call before he could finish. The social warfare began within hours. By Sunday morning, my phone was flooded with messages from relatives I barely spoke to. Most were variations on the same theme. "How could you do this to your father? This is so inappropriate. Your mother would be ashamed." My father had clearly spent Saturday evening making calls, crafting his narrative. From the messages, I could piece together what he'd told people: I was having some kind of breakdown. I'd become fixated on the idea that I deserved the house. I was always difficult and never satisfied. I was motivated by greed and vindictiveness. A few relatives tried to be more diplomatic. My cousin Jason called asking, "What's really going on? This seems out of character for you." I appreciated that he at least asked rather than assuming. "The court documents are public record," I told him. "If you want to know my side, you can read the filing. It's all there, every document, every piece of evidence. I'm not going to defend myself by repeating what's already in writing." "But suing Dad? That's pretty extreme." "Read the filing," I repeated. "Then decide what you think is extreme." Most relatives didn't bother asking for my side. They'd been conditioned for decades to accept my father's version of reality. Why would they question it now? Aunt Linda left a voicemail saying she was heartbroken that I would attack my father like this. Uncle Mark sent a text saying I should be ashamed. Rebecca didn't contact me at all, which was somehow worse than the angry messages. But there were a few surprises. Eleanor sent a card saying she was proud of me for honoring my mother's wishes. A distant cousin I barely knew sent a message, "I remember your mom. She was a good woman. I hope you get what she wanted you to have." Even Mrs. Grayson, the neighbor from the memorial event, called to say she'd never quite trusted my father's version of things. By Monday morning, I'd blocked half my extended family's numbers and archived dozens of hostile messages. The ostracism I'd always feared was happening in real time. The family I'd spent 36 years trying to belong to was closing ranks against me. But as I sat with that reality, I realized something profound. I'd always feared being ostracized from my family. But once it actually happened, I realized I'd been living in exile my entire life. I just hadn't named it yet. The weeks between filing and the hearing passed in a strange, suspended state. I went to work, paid my bills, lived my life, but everything felt provisional, like I was waiting for something definitive to either destroy me or set me free. April 15th arrived with unseasonable heat. I met Margaret outside the courthouse at 8:30, both of us dressed in conservative business attire. The building was imposing from the outside, but institutional inside, fluorescent lighting, tile floors, bulletin boards covered in legal notices. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined from television dramas, maybe 30 feet by 40 with wooden benches that reminded me of church pews. My father was already seated at the defense table with his attorney, a man named Richard Caldwell, who specialized in estate litigation. Caldwell was in his 50s, expensively dressed with the confidence of someone who'd won more cases than he'd lost. My father wouldn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands folded on the table in front of him. Judge Patricia Reeves entered at exactly 9 o'clock. She was in her early 60s, black with close-cropped gray hair, and an expression that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of family dysfunction and wasn't easily impressed. We all stood as she took the bench. This is a petition to reopen probate on the estate of Elena Martinez, deceased June 2011. Judge Reeves said, reading from her notes. This is not a full trial. This is a hearing to determine whether sufficient cause exists to warrant reopening a case that was closed 13 years ago. I've reviewed the initial filing, Ms. Chen, you may present your argument. Margaret stood and approached the podium. She was professional, precise, methodical. She walked the judge through our evidence systematically. The handwritten will dated November 2009. My mother's letter explaining why she'd written it. The journal entries documenting her discovery of my father's financial betrayal. The bank records showing the unauthorized mortgage, Eleanor's testimony about my mother's explicit final wishes. Judge Reeves interrupted several times with questions. Why is this evidence only surfacing now 13 years after probate closed? Margaret explained about the safety deposit box, about my mother adding me as joint holder without telling me about my recent discovery prompted by my father's suspicious financial requests. And you're alleging what exactly? That the will submitted in 2011 was fraudulent. We're alleging it either didn't reflect Mrs. Martinez's true final wishes or was obtained under duress during her terminal illness. The handwritten will written earlier when she was unquestionably competent represents her actual testamentary intent. Judge Reeves turned to my father's attorney. Mr. Caldwell. Caldwell stood with practiced ease. Your Honor, this case hinges on a fundamental question. Did Elena Martinez have testamentary capacity when she wrote the documents my opponent is presenting? We contend she did not. He approached the bench with a folder. Your Honor, I'm submitting medical records from Mrs. Martinez's neurologist dated October 2009 and February 2010, the same period when she allegedly wrote this handwritten will and letter. These records document cognitive testing and show evidence of mental decline. My stomach dropped. Margaret hadn't mentioned anything about my mother having cognitive issues. I watched her face carefully, but she remained impassive. Caldwell continued, his voice confident and sympathetic. The neurologist's report notes mild cognitive changes consistent with early-stage vascular dementia. Your Honor, Mrs. Martinez was experiencing cognitive decline during the exact period when she supposedly wrote these documents. A person experiencing dementia lacks the legal capacity to create a valid will. This isn't about family dysfunction or financial disputes. This is about a sick woman whose deteriorating mental state is being exploited posthumously by a daughter seeking financial gain. The words hit like physical blows. He was arguing my mother wasn't competent, that her desperate attempt to protect me was the product of a failing mind. Several people in the gallery, relatives my father had brought for support, nodded along with this narrative. Judge Reeves examined the medical records carefully. "Ms. Chen, have you seen these records?" "No, Your Honor. May I request a brief recess to review them?" 15 minutes. We retreated to a small conference room. Margaret spread the medical records across the table, reading quickly with the intense focus I'd come to recognize. After 10 minutes, she looked up and smiled grimly. "He's misrepresenting the records. Deliberately or because he didn't read them carefully, doesn't matter. We can refute this." When court resumed, Margaret approached the bench with controlled intensity. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the medical records opposing counsel submitted. He's correct that Mrs. Martinez underwent memory screening in October 2009 and February 2010. However, he conveniently omitted crucial context from those same records." She held up a highlighted section. "The neurologist's complete notes state, patient reports recent memory difficulties and requested cognitive screening. Testing shows mild cognitive changes. However, these appear reactive to acute stress rather than progressive dementia. Patient disclosed recent discovery of spouse's significant financial deception, which has caused severe emotional distress and sleep disruption. Symptoms consistent with acute stress response, not vascular dementia. Recommend stress management counseling and follow-up in 3 months if symptoms persist." Margaret's voice was steady but forceful. "Your Honor, these records don't show dementia. They show a woman whose husband betrayed her so profoundly that it affected her sleep and caused stress-related memory issues. The neurologist explicitly distinguished this from dementia." Judge Reeves looked at Caldwell. "Is this accurate? Does the full record indicate stress rather than dementia?" Caldwell hesitated, flipping through his copy. "The terminology used by the neurologist in yes or no counsel. Does your own exhibit contradict your argument?" The initial assessment mentioned dementia as a possibility, which was later ruled out in favor of acute stress reaction, Margaret interjected. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Dr. Eleanor Martinez, the neurologist who authored these records, to clarify." It turned out Margaret had been prepared for this exact scenario. Dr. Martinez, now retired and in her 70s, had been waiting in the hallway. She took the stand and was sworn in. "Dr. Martinez, do you recall treating Elena Martinez in 2009 and 2010? "Yes, I do. She was referred to me for memory concerns. After evaluation, I determined her cognitive symptoms were stress-related, not indicative of dementia or diminished capacity." In your medical opinion, did Mrs. Martinez have the mental capacity to make legal decisions during that period? "Absolutely. She was sharp, articulate, and fully aware of her circumstances. In fact, she specifically asked me whether her stress symptoms would affect her ability to handle legal matters. I assured her they would not. She told me she was planning to make some important decisions about her estate and wanted to ensure she was competent to do so." The courtroom was silent. My father's face had gone pale. Judge Reeves was taking extensive notes. Margaret continued, "So the records my opponent submitted don't show incompetence. They show exactly why Mrs. Martinez felt compelled to protect her daughter, because her husband's betrayal was so traumatic, it was affecting her health." Dr. Martinez nodded. "That's correct. She was absolutely devastated. But devastated and incompetent are very different things." As Dr. Martinez stepped down, I finally understood the full scope of what my father had tried to do. He'd attempted to use my mother's pain he'd caused as proof she couldn't think clearly, but the evidence revealed exactly why she was so desperate to protect me. After Dr. Martinez's testimony, Judge Reeves called for additional briefings and scheduled closing arguments for early June. The 2 months between April and June were among the longest of my life. I worked, I functioned, but part of me was suspended, waiting for a decision that would either validate everything I'd fought for or leave me with nothing but destroyed relationships and legal debt. On June 10th, Margaret called. The judge issued her ruling. "We need to be in court tomorrow morning at 9 for the formal reading." I barely slept that night. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, finding Margaret already there reviewing notes. My father and Caldwell arrived separately, neither acknowledging my presence. I noticed Rebecca slip into the back of the gallery, her face drawn and anxious. Judge Reeves entered precisely at 9. We stood as she took the bench, and I noticed she carried a thick document, her written ruling. "Please be seated." She adjusted her reading glasses and began. "This court has carefully reviewed all evidence submitted, witness testimony, medical records, and legal arguments presented by both parties regarding the petition to reopen the probate of Elena Martinez, deceased June 2011. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The central questions before this court are, first, whether the handwritten will dated November 2009 represents valid testamentary intent. Second, whether the will submitted for probate in 2011 accurately reflects the decedent's final wishes. And third, whether there exists sufficient cause to reopen a probate case closed 13 years ago. Judge Reeves looked up from her document, her gaze sweeping across both tables. This court finds that the answer to all three questions is yes. I felt Margaret's hand briefly touch my arm, a gesture of restrained celebration. The handwritten will dated November 2009 is corroborated by contemporaneous documentation including the decedent's personal letters, journal entries, and testimony from witnesses with no financial stake in this matter. The medical evidence presented by the respondent, rather than undermining Mrs. Martinez's testamentary capacity, actually supports her awareness of financial wrongdoing and her determination to protect her daughter from it. Dr. Martinez's testimony was particularly compelling. Mrs. Martinez was not suffering from dementia, but from acute stress caused by discovering her husband's financial deception. I saw my father's shoulders stiffen. Furthermore, Judge Reeves continued, the circumstances surrounding the 2011 probate raise significant concerns. The will submitted at that time contradicts the earlier handwritten will without clear explanation, the timing mere weeks after Mrs. Martinez's death while family members were grieving suggests possible exploitation of vulnerable circumstances. While this court cannot conclusively determine fraud without further investigation, the evidence presented warrants serious scrutiny. She paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom. Therefore, this court orders the following. First, the 2011 probate order is hereby set aside. Second, the handwritten will dated November 2009 is admitted as the valid expression of Elena Martinez's testamentary intent. Third, the property located at 4782 Sycamore Drive shall be transferred to Kimberly Martinez as designated in said will. The words washed over me like water. The house. My mother's house. The protection she'd tried to give me. It was mine. But Judge Reeves wasn't finished. Additionally, Thomas Martinez is hereby ordered to provide a full accounting of all estate assets from 2011 to present, including but not limited to proceeds from the 2010 mortgage origination refinance transactions and any funds appropriated from the estate that should have been distributed according to the decedent's actual wishes. Based on preliminary evidence, Mr. Martinez appears to owe the estate approximately $127,000 in misappropriated funds, including a refund for travel expenses that were paid by the petitioner but issued to Mr. Martinez. My father's face had gone from pale to gray. Caldwell was scribbling frantically on his legal pad. Mr. Martinez has 90 days to provide said accounting and remit payment. Failure to comply will result in court-ordered liquidation of assets or placement of liens on any remaining property. Furthermore, this court is referring this matter to the Arizona Attorney General's Office for investigation into potential fraud, forgery, or financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Judge Reeves removed her glasses. This is not a criminal proceeding, and I make no findings regarding criminal conduct. However, the circumstances warrant investigation by appropriate authorities. Mr. Caldwell, you have 30 days to file an appeal if you choose to do so. This ruling is effective immediately. She struck her gavel once. Court is adjourned. As everyone stood, I watched my father. His face had drained of all color. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Caldwell was already talking to him in low, urgent tones, no doubt discussing appeal options. Rebecca was still in the back of the gallery, crying quietly. Not angry tears, they looked like relief mixed with fear. She caught my eye for a brief moment, and I couldn't read her expression. Then she stood and left quickly. Margaret was gathering our materials, professional satisfaction evident in her careful movements. That was about as comprehensive a win as we could have hoped for. The criminal referral is significant. It means the judge saw enough evidence of wrongdoing to warrant state investigation. I nodded, still processing. We walked out of the courtroom, and in the hallway, I found Eleanor waiting. She'd attended every hearing, sitting quietly in support. When she saw me, she smiled a small, knowing smile. "Your mother would be so proud," she said simply. Those words broke something open in me that I'd been holding back for months. I felt tears spill down my cheeks, and I didn't try to stop them. This wasn't victory crying. This was grief. Grief that my mother had spent her final year fighting this battle alone. Grief that she'd died before seeing justice. Grief for all the years I'd tried to earn love from a man incapable of giving it. Eleanor pulled me into a hug, and I cried on the shoulder of my mother's friend, while Margaret stood respectfully aside. When I finally pulled away, wiping my eyes, I looked back toward the courtroom. Through the window, I could see my father still sitting at the defense table, Caldwell talking, but my father just staring at nothing. He'd spent 15 years building a lie. It took 4 months in court to tear it down, but the real consequences were just beginning. The 90-day deadline Judge Reeves had set loomed over everything that summer. My father had until September 8th to provide a full accounting of estate assets and remit the $127,000 the court had determined he owed. Margaret advised me to prepare for an appeal, but as weeks passed, no appeal was filed. Instead, she received communication from Caldwell indicating my father intended to comply. I didn't believe it until I received the first payment in mid-July, a check for $15,000 representing the Christmas trip refund plus interest. The check cleared. A week later, another payment arrived, $8,500. Margaret called after receiving notice that my father was liquidating assets. "He's selling everything he can," she told me. His car went to a dealership. He cashed out what remained of his retirement account, about $34,000 after penalties. He's taken out a personal loan, though, at his age and credit situation, the interest rate is brutal. I felt no satisfaction in this news. Just a hollow recognition that the structure of lies he'd built over 15 years was collapsing under its own weight, exactly as it always would have eventually. By late August, he'd managed to scrape together $89,000 of the $127,000. Caldwell negotiated a payment plan for the remainder monthly installments that would take 2 years to complete. The judge approved it, noting dryly that Mr. Martinez's financial situation appeared precarious at best. What Margaret didn't tell me, what I learned later from unexpected sources, was that my father's financial collapse went deeper than the court judgment. Rebecca had been right about the gambling debts. When the court case became public record, loan sharks and bookies he'd been juggling for years sensed instability and started demanding payment. The house of cards, already shaky, toppled completely. By October, he'd filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The house that had been the center of this entire conflict was no longer his to worry about. It was mine, transferred legally and irrevocably. His other assets, already liquidated, couldn't satisfy his creditors. At 68, in deteriorating health, he found himself living in a modest apartment funded by Social Security and a small pension. The social consequences were perhaps harder for him to bear than the financial ones. Our community is small enough that the court case became known and details spread the way details do. Church members who'd attended his carefully orchestrated memorial service learned the truth. The devoted husband who'd spoken so movingly had stolen from his dying wife's intended will. Neighbors who'd respected him for years discovered he'd manipulated both daughters through different forms of coercion. Nobody confronted him dramatically or publicly shunned him. The ostracism was quieter, more insidious. Invitations to social events stopped coming. When he attended church, people greeted him politely but briefly, then moved away. Phone calls went unreturned. The men who used to stop by his house to watch football games found other places to gather. I heard about this not from him, obviously, but from Mrs. Grayson, the neighbor who'd befriended my mother. She called me one evening in late September. "I thought you should know," she said carefully. "Your father is very isolated. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty you did what you had to do. But I've watched him over the past months, and he's alone in a way I've never seen before." "He was alone when he had everyone around him," I said quietly. "He just didn't know it because people were still useful to him." Mrs. Grayson was quiet for a moment. "You're probably right. I just wanted you to know." What surprised me was Rebecca. For months after the verdict, we had no contact. I assumed she'd sided with our father completely, that whatever relationship we'd had, tenuous as it was, had been destroyed. Then, in November, I received a text from her. "I filed for bankruptcy last month. Dad demanded immediate repayment of everything he'd loaned me. I couldn't do it anymore. Jake and I are in counseling. The kids are okay. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know you were right. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to see it sooner." I stared at that message for a long time. Margaret had warned me that my father would retaliate against Rebecca, would try to drag her down with him. And he had. The moment Rebecca stopped providing him with emotional labor, stopped answering his calls, as frequently stopped managing his reputation, stopped playing the role of devoted daughter, he'd weaponized the debt he'd held over her for 7 years. Rebecca's bankruptcy was public, humiliating, and inevitable. But according to her text, it was also liberating. The debt that had controlled her life, the threat that had forced her into complicity, no longer had power over her. She'd lost her financial reputation, but gained something more valuable: freedom from his control. I didn't respond to her text immediately. The damage between us was too extensive for a quick reconciliation. But I didn't delete it either. I saved it a small acknowledgement that she'd finally seen what I'd seen, even if it had taken her too long to get there. Diana from my office had once told me that people who benefit from your silence will fight hardest when you speak. My father had spent decades building relationships on control, debt, and fear with me, with Rebecca, with anyone who got close enough for him to manipulate. Those relationships had given him power status, the appearance of being a devoted family man. But foundations built on control are inherently unstable. Eventually they collapse. Not because someone tears them down, but because they can't support their own weight. He didn't lose his family because I sued him. He lost his family because he'd built every relationship on control, debt, and fear, and those foundations eventually crumble under their own weight. The weeks after Rebecca's text settled into a new kind of normal. I went to work, came home, lived my life without the constant background hum of family obligation that had defined my existence for 36 years. The silence was strange at first, almost disorienting, but gradually it became peaceful. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday evening in late September. My father's name appeared on the screen, and for several rings I simply stared at it. I'd blocked most of my extended family's numbers, but I'd left his active not because I wanted contact, but because I wanted to choose whether to answer rather than being forced into it. Curiosity won. Or maybe it was the need for some kind of closure. I picked up. "Kimberly." His voice sounded different. Smaller somehow, older, stripped of the authoritative tone that had colored every conversation we'd had my entire life. "It's Dad. I need to talk to you." Not, "we need to talk," or "I want to discuss something." He was asking. The shift was jarring enough that I stayed silent, waiting to see what would come next. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," he continued, speaking into my silence. "But I'm struggling. The bankruptcy, the payments to you, it's all so much harder than I expected. I'm living in this apartment, I can barely afford groceries some weeks, and I don't know how I'm going to manage." I felt something twist in my chest. Not pity exactly, but recognition of his suffering. Despite everything, he was still my father. 36 years of conditioning don't disappear in 6 months. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "About your mother, about the choices I made. I made mistakes, Kimberly. I see that now. I wish I'd done things differently. I wish I'd been the father you deserved, the husband your mother deserved." Mistakes. The word hung in the air between us. He still couldn't say, "I'm sorry," couldn't take direct ownership. But he was using the language of apology, getting as close as he seemed capable of getting. "Are you there?" he asked when I didn't respond. "I'm here." Part of me, the part that had been the family fixer since childhood, the part that had been trained to respond to crisis with action, wanted to ask what he needed. Wanted to solve this problem the way I'd solved every other family problem for 36 years. I could feel the pull of old patterns, the desire to make peace, to restore some version of family connection even if it was imperfect. I imagined what it might look like: boundaries, yes, but contact. Awkward phone calls at first, maybe eventually coffee meetings where we discussed neutral topics and carefully avoided the past. A relationship rebuilt slowly, painfully, but rebuilt nonetheless. The fantasy had a certain appeal, the idea that families could heal, that people could change, that love could overcome even the deepest betrayals. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel him sensing an opening. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, his voice softening. "I know I hurt you and your mother in ways that can't be fixed. But maybe we can try moving forward. Not forget, just try. You're still my daughter, Kimberly." That last sentence nearly broke me. After family only, after the exclusion and theft and manipulation, he was claiming me as his daughter, asking me to claim him as my father. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of this moment. This was the test. Everything I'd learned, every boundary I'd set, every piece of clarity I'd gained, it all came down to this choice. "Dad," I said finally, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I need you to understand something. What you did wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are accidents. You forget someone's birthday. You make a bad investment. You say something thoughtless. What you did was systematic. You spent 15 years stealing from Mom, manipulating me, blackmailing Rebecca. You didn't make bad decisions in a moment of weakness. You made calculated choices over and over again. Kimberly, that's not—" "Let me finish." I surprised myself with the firmness in my voice. "I can forgive you. I'm working toward that in therapy, because forgiveness is about me finding peace, not about you being absolved. But forgiveness doesn't mean I trust you. It doesn't mean I resume a relationship. And it definitely doesn't mean I help you financially or emotionally manage the consequences of your own actions. I'm your father. You taught me an important lesson." I continued, not letting him derail me. "Family isn't just biology. It's behavior. It's how you treat people, how you show up for them, whether you build them up or tear them down. And your behavior toward me, toward Mom, toward Rebecca, it's never been familial. It's been transactional at best, exploitative at worst." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost feel his calculations as he processed what I was saying. When he spoke again, all the vulnerability was gone. His voice had hardened back into something familiar. "So that's it. You're just going to abandon your father. Leave me to struggle alone while you sit in that house that should have been mine." There it was, the real him under the performance of contrition. "Dad, you abandoned me a long time ago. When you took my money and excluded me from the trip. When you stole from Mom. When you built your entire relationship with me on my utility rather than my humanity. I'm not abandoning you. I'm just finally acknowledging what's always been true." "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice cold now. "One day you'll need something, and you'll remember that you turned your back on family." "Goodbye, Dad." I ended the call before he could say anything else. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, and felt something release in my chest. He'd wanted me to save him one more time. But I'd finally learned that saving someone who refuses to change only destroys you both. The days after ending that phone call with my father were harder than the lawsuit itself had been. During the legal battle, I'd had clarity, evidence, documentation, a clear sense of right and wrong. But in the quiet aftermath, old programming kicked in with a vengeance. I'd wake at 3 in the morning with my mind racing through the same questions. Was I too harsh? Should I have offered some kind of compromise? What if something happens to him and I never tried to repair things? The guilt was like a living thing in my chest, whispering that good daughters don't abandon their fathers, that families should forgive, that I was being selfish and cruel. The voice sounded like my father, but also like Rebecca, like Aunt Linda, like every relative who'd called me ungrateful. It sounded most devastatingly like a version of myself I'd been taught to be the practical daughter who solved problems without complaint, who absorbed pain so others could be comfortable. I'd find myself replaying our last conversation, editing it in my mind. Maybe if I'd been gentler, more compassionate. Maybe if I'd offered some small financial help with clear boundaries. Maybe if I'd agreed to occasional contact supervised and limited. The maybes multiplied like weeds, choking out the clarity I'd worked so hard to achieve. 2 weeks after the call, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 7 in the morning, coffee growing cold in front of me, when I realized I hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. The guilt was literally making me sick. I picked up my phone and texted Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist I'd started seeing 6 months earlier on Margaret's recommendation. Emergency session available, Dr. Chen had been invaluable during the lawsuit, helping me process the trauma of family betrayal and maintain emotional boundaries during intense legal proceedings. She was in her late 40s, direct but compassionate, with the kind of calm presence that made it safe to fall apart. She had an opening that afternoon. I took it. Her office was in a converted house near downtown, painted in soothing blues and grays. I'd been there enough times that the space felt safe. When I settled into the familiar chair across from her, I didn't wait for her usual opening question. "I don't know if I'm a good person anymore," I said, and then the dam broke. Good daughters don't sue their fathers. Good daughters don't walk away when their parents are struggling. I keep telling myself I did the right thing, but what if I'm just rationalizing? What if I'm actually cruel and vindictive and everything my family says I am? Dr. Chen let me cry for several minutes before speaking. When she did, her voice was gentle but firm. "Kimberly, I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to really think about your answer. Can you do that?" I nodded, wiping my eyes. If a woman came to you, a friend, a colleague, someone you cared about, and told you her story, but it was your story. Her father stole from her dying mother, excluded her from a family trip she'd paid for, manipulated her for decades, demanded money while providing nothing in return. And then, after she'd established legal boundaries and walked away, he called asking for help, and she felt guilty for not providing it. What would you tell that woman? I started to answer, then stopped. Really thought about it. Pictured someone else, maybe Diana from work, maybe a younger woman seeking advice, sitting across from me with tears in her eyes, asking if she was wrong to protect herself. "I'd tell her she did nothing wrong," I said slowly. "I'd tell her that walking away from someone who hurt her doesn't make her a bad person, that she deserves better than people who only value her for what she can provide." Would you call her selfish, cruel, vindictive? No, never. I'd tell her she was brave. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. Then why are you applying a completely different standard to yourself? The question landed like a physical blow, because I had been. For weeks, I'd been holding myself to expectations I would never ever impose on someone I cared about. I'd been using a metric that said my worth was measured by my willingness to endure mistreatment, that love meant sacrifice without reciprocity, that being a good daughter required accepting abuse. The guilt you're feeling, Dr. Chen continued, isn't your conscience telling you that you did something wrong. It's the final mechanism of control. Your father and your family spent 36 years conditioning you to believe that your value lies in your utility, that prioritizing your own well-being is selfish. That conditioning doesn't disappear just because you've legally established boundaries. It's still there, still functioning, still trying to pull you back into patterns that hurt you. So what do I do with it? You recognize it for what it is. When that voice tells you you're selfish, you acknowledge that's not my voice. That's the voice of people who benefited from my self-sacrifice. When it tells you you're cruel, you remember setting boundaries isn't cruelty. When it tells you you're a bad daughter, you remind yourself, I was always a good daughter. I was never a valued one. Over the next several weeks, I practiced this reframing. Each time guilt surfaced, and it surfaced often, I'd stop and ask myself whose voice I was hearing. Almost never my own. Usually my father's, sometimes my aunt's, occasionally Rebecca's from years past. I started recognizing the guilt for what it was, not moral truth, but psychological conditioning. And slowly, incrementally, it began to lose its power. Around the same time, I started actively building what Dr. Chen called chosen family relationships, based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than biological obligation or transactional utility. Diana from work became someone I talked to several times a week, not just about family issues, but about life. Books we were reading, shows we were watching, the small frustrations and joys of daily existence. She invited me to her daughter's wedding in November, and I went witnessing a family dynamic so different from my own that it felt like visiting another planet. People who celebrated each other's successes, who showed affection freely, who didn't keep score. I joined a support group for people who'd gone through estate litigation and family estrangement. Meeting once a month in a community center conference room, we'd share our stories. I heard from a woman whose siblings had emptied their mother's bank account while she was in hospice. A man whose father had forged his signature on loan documents. A woman whose entire extended family had ostracized her for reporting financial elder abuse. These were people who understood the specific grief of losing family not to death, but to boundaries. They understood that you could grieve relationships with living people, that cutting contact could be both the right choice and incredibly painful, that, but their family, was often the phrase people used to justify tolerating abuse. In that room, I didn't have to explain why I'd sued my father. No one questioned whether the house was worth it. They understood that it was never about the house, it was about truth, justice, and refusing to let theft and manipulation stand unchallenged simply because it came wrapped in the language of family. I also started saying yes to things I'd always declined because of family obligations. A weekend trip to Santa Fe with colleagues. A painting class that met on Sunday mornings, the time I used to reserve for potential family demands. A book club that sometimes gathered for hours discussing novels and drinking wine. I built a life that didn't revolve around managing other people's crises or earning approval I'd never receive. And in building that life, I discovered something profound. I actually liked myself. Not the version of myself I'd performed for my family, compliant, self-effacing, endlessly available, but the real person underneath. I was funny. I had opinions about architecture and literature and whether cilantro tastes like soap. I was capable of deep friendships where I both gave and received support. I was whole, complete, valuable, independent of my utility to others. 3 months after my father's last phone call, I was having dinner with Diana when she asked, "Do you ever regret it? The lawsuit, cutting contact, all of it?" I thought about it honestly. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my mother died trying to protect me and didn't live to see justice. I regret that Rebecca spent 7 years being blackmailed. But do I regret walking away? I paused, feeling the truth of what I was about to say. No. I spent 36 years believing guilt was love, believing sacrifice without reciprocity was noble, believing my worth came from how much I could endure, learning to live without that guilt. I smiled at her. It felt like learning to breathe for the first time. By mid-December, the guilt had loosened its grip enough that I could think about the approaching holidays without my chest tightening. This would be my first Christmas completely separate from my family. No obligation, no performance, no navigating landmines of past resentments while pretending everything was fine. Diana noticed my quiet around this time and asked during one of our coffee meetings what my plans were. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't thought about it. I guess I'll just stay home, make it low-key." She set down her cup and looked at me seriously. "Or you could come to my house. It won't be fancy, just me, my kids, their partners, maybe a few friends. Very casual. But if you don't want to be alone, you'd be welcome. The offer caught me off guard. Christmas had always been family complicated tense, but family. The idea of spending it with people who'd known me less than 2 years felt strange, but also unexpectedly safe. I don't want to intrude. Kimberly, I'm inviting you. That's not an intrusion. Think about it and let me know. I thought about it for 3 days, weighing the discomfort of breaking tradition against the discomfort of sitting alone in my condo, pretending the holidays weren't happening. Finally, I texted Diana. If the offer's still open, I'd love to come. Her response was immediate. Perfect. Come around too. Bring nothing. We have too much food already. Christmas Day arrived with unusually warm weather for Phoenix, mid-70s, and sunny. I drove to Diana's house in Scottsdale, a modest ranch-style home with a yard full of native plants and a cheerful wreath on the front door. Inside, the atmosphere was exactly as Diana had promised, warm but low-key. Her daughter Melissa and son-in-law were in the kitchen preparing food. Her son Jordan was setting up a board game on the coffee table. Christmas music played softly in the background, not the traditional carols I'd grown up with, but jazz versions that felt sophisticated and relaxed. Diana introduced me to everyone. No one asked invasive questions about why I was spending Christmas with them instead of my own family. Melissa simply said, "Mom's told us a lot about you. We're glad you could make it," and handed me a glass of wine. We ate around 3 turkey and all the traditional sides, but served buffet style, everyone taking what they wanted and settling wherever they were comfortable. Conversation flowed easily, touching on work, current events, a movie Melissa had seen, Jordan's plans to go back to graduate school. At no point did I feel like I was walking on eggshells, monitoring my words, or managing someone else's emotional state. This, I realized with startling clarity, is what holidays feel like without tension, without the undercurrent of resentment and obligation, without having to perform gratitude for mistreatment disguised as generosity. After dinner, we played the board game. Jordan had set up a cooperative game where we worked together rather than competed. There was laughter, playful arguments over strategy, genuine enjoyment. When I left around 8, Diana walked me to my car. "Thank you," I said, "for including me, for not asking questions." "Everyone deserves to have good holidays," she said simply. "I'm glad you came." Driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt during the holidays in years: contentment. Not forced cheerfulness or performed family unity, but genuine quiet peace. The next morning, I decided it was time to visit the house. I'd been avoiding it since the verdict in June. Legally, it had been mine for 6 months, the deed transferred, the title clear. But I hadn't been back. Part of me wasn't ready. Another part was afraid of what it would feel like to walk through those rooms, knowing everything I now knew. But it was time. I drove to Sycamore Drive on a cool Thursday morning, parking in the driveway of the house I'd grown up in. The exterior looked the same: pale yellow siding, dark green trim, the mature trees my mother had planted decades ago. Mrs. Grayson was in her yard next door and waved. I waved back, but didn't approach. I wasn't ready for conversation yet. The key Margaret had given me, copied from the deed transfer documents, felt heavy in my hand. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like it had been closed up for months. My father had moved out in August when he could no longer afford it, taking only what he could fit in his small apartment. Everything else remained: furniture, dishes, photos still on the walls. I walked through slowly, room by room. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents, where I'd done homework while my parents watched television. The kitchen where my mother had taught me to cook, where I'd sat at that table doing elementary school projects. The hallway lined with family photos, most featuring Rebecca, prominently me less so. My old bedroom was exactly as I'd left it when I'd moved out at 23. The bed was different, replaced at some point, but the same pale blue walls, the bookshelf still holding my high school yearbooks. It felt like a museum of a person who no longer existed. I'd thought this moment would feel triumphant. I'd won. The house was mine. My mother's wish had been honored. But standing in these rooms, I felt mostly sadness. This house was my mother's final gift, yes. but it was also a monument to my father's 15-year betrayal. Every room held both good memories and complicated ones. I realized I didn't want to live here. Too many ghosts, too much history that I needed distance from rather than immersion in. But I also wasn't ready to sell it. Not yet. This house meant something to my mother, to the legal battle we'd fought, to the principle that truth and justice matter even when they're hard. I'd take time to decide what it should become. Maybe I'd rent it to a family who'd fill it with better memories. Maybe eventually I'd sell it and use the money for something my mother would have approved of. For now, I just needed to know it was mine. That the theft had been reversed. That my mother's desperate attempt to protect me had succeeded even if it took 13 years. I locked the door behind me and drove home feeling lighter than I'd expected. That evening, Christmas Eve, I found myself alone in my condo with tea and the soft instrumental music I preferred when I needed to think. The past year played through my mind like a film, the family-only moment, the discovery of my mother's will, the lawsuit, the verdict, the slow process of building a new life without the weight of family obligation. On impulse, I pulled out nice stationery, the kind my mother used to use for important letters, and began to write. "Dear Mom." I started, and then the words flowed. I told her about finding the safety deposit box, about reading her letter, and realizing how much she'd tried to protect me. I told her about Margaret, about Eleanor keeping her journal safe for 13 years, about Dr. Martinez testifying on her behalf. I described the legal battle the moment Judge Reeves ruled in our favor, the vindication of her final wishes. "I know you wanted me to have the house," I wrote, "but I think what you really wanted was for me to understand that I deserved to be protected. That I didn't have to accept mistreatment just because it came from family. That love isn't supposed to hurt that way." I told her about walking away from Dad, about the guilt and how I'd worked through it. About Diana and the support group and the life I was building that didn't revolve around managing other people's dysfunction. "I'm sorry you didn't get to see this through yourself." I continued, tears blurring the words slightly. "I'm sorry you had to fight alone while you were dying. I'm sorry you spent your last year trying to protect me from someone who should have been protecting both of us." I paused, pressing my palm against my eyes until I could see clearly again. "But I finished what you started. The house is mine. Dad can't hurt me anymore. Rebecca is figuring out her own path. And me, I'm okay, Mom. Not perfect, not healed completely. Some days are still hard, but I'm okay in a way I never was before. I think that's what you wanted most, not for me to have a house, but for me to be okay without them." I wrote about Christmas at Diana's, about what it felt like to celebrate a holiday without tension. About learning that family could be chosen, that love didn't have to be earned through endless sacrifice, that I was allowed to be happy. "You were right about so many things," I concluded. "You were right that Dad couldn't be trusted. You were right that I needed to be strong. You were right to try to protect me, even when you couldn't finish what you started. I hope wherever you are, you know that it worked. You saved me, Mom. It just took me a while to understand how." I signed it, folded it carefully, and placed it in a wooden box alongside her letter to me, her journal, and the handwritten will. Then I put the box on my bookshelf where I could see it but didn't have to open it unless I chose to. Sitting in my quiet living room, I felt something settle in my chest. For the first time in my life, Christmas wasn't about what I owed anyone. It wasn't about performing gratitude or managing someone else's expectations or proving my worth through sacrifice. It was about what I'd finally given myself: peace. The year that followed that first peaceful Christmas was transformative in ways I couldn't have predicted. I settled into my new life with increasing confidence, deepening friendships that weren't based on obligation and discovering parts of myself I'd kept hidden for decades. The support group I'd joined became a monthly anchor. Diana and I grew even closer. I started dating casually, nothing serious, but the act of putting myself out there felt like reclaiming territory I'd ceded long ago. My father existed as a distant fact, like weather in another state. I knew he was out there somewhere dealing with consequences, but he'd ceased to occupy space in my daily thoughts. That distance itself felt like victory. Then December 2025 arrived, marking a full year since that Christmas at Diana's house. Margaret called on a Tuesday afternoon. "I wanted to give you an update," she said. "The Attorney General's office has closed their investigation into your father's case." My chest tightened reflexively. "And they declined to pursue criminal charges. Too much time has elapsed since the original probate, and while they found the circumstances suspicious, they couldn't establish criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The statute of limitations on most of what he did has expired." I'd expected this, but hearing it still stung. "So he gets away with it?" "Not exactly." Margaret's voice was careful. "Criminal charges aren't the only form of accountability. The civil judgment stands. He's paid most of what he owes you, though he's still on that payment plan for the remainder. And from what I understand, his financial situation has continued to deteriorate." "How do you know that?" "Public records. He filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in June. Everything he owned, or rather everything he still owned after paying you, has been liquidated to satisfy his creditors. The gambling debts Rebecca mentioned were real and apparently extensive. He's living in a small apartment in Mesa, now subsisting on Social Security and a minimal pension. It's not poverty, but it's a far cry from the comfortable retirement he'd planned." I absorbed this information quietly. I'd won the house, established the truth about my mother's wishes, and walked away. What happened to him after that wasn't my responsibility. But hearing the details felt oddly hollow. No satisfaction, just a resigned acknowledgement that actions have consequences. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "There's one more thing," Margaret added. "The house. Have you decided what you want to do with it?" I'd been thinking about this. "I'm going to sell it in the spring. I've made peace with what it represents, but I don't need to keep it. I'll use part of the proceeds to set up a scholarship at the community college in my mother's name. The rest will go toward my retirement and maybe a small place in Sedona I've been looking at." "That sounds like a good plan. Let me know when you're ready and I can recommend a real estate attorney." After we hung up, I sat with the news about my father. The man who'd once seemed so powerful, so in control, was now living alone in a small apartment, his carefully constructed life dismantled piece by piece. Not because I'd destroyed him, but because the structure he'd built on lies and manipulation had collapsed under its own weight. The bankruptcy, the lost assets, the isolation, all of it was the natural result of decades of financial mismanagement and relationship exploitation. I'd simply been the catalyst that exposed what was already rotting underneath. Over the following weeks, I heard more through the grapevine, that strange network of former family connections who still talked despite the fractures. Mrs. Grayson called in January. "I thought you should know your father fell and broke his hip last month. He was in the hospital for a week." "Is he okay?" I asked, feeling an automatic concern that immediately made me check myself. Was I supposed to care? Did caring mean I had to act? "He's recovering. He's back in his apartment using a walker. I visited once old neighbor courtesy, but Kimberly, he's very isolated. I barely recognized him." "Did he ask you to call me?" A pause. "No. I'm calling on my own. I'm not suggesting you reach out to him. I just thought you should know." I thanked her and ended the call. The news settled somewhere in my chest, not guilt exactly, but a complicated sadness. He was my father, even if he'd never truly acted like one. His suffering didn't erase what he'd done, but it was suffering nonetheless. I didn't call him, I didn't visit, but I also didn't feel good about not doing those things. I just felt clear. Clear that my presence wouldn't help him, that it would only reopen wounds I'd worked hard to heal, that some distances are necessary for survival. Rebecca's path had diverged from mine in interesting ways. We'd had coffee twice over the past year, awkward, careful meetings where we talked around the hardest topics but acknowledged the damage between us. She'd been in therapy since her bankruptcy, working through her own patterns of people-pleasing and financial self-sabotage. I talked to Dad maybe once every 2 months. she'd told me during our last meeting in November. Usually just checking if he's alive. The conversations are short, formal, like talking to a distant relative I barely know. How does that feel? She'd considered the question carefully. Sad, but also necessary. I spent so many years being terrified of losing his approval of having him call in that debt. Now that I've lost his approval and the debt is gone through bankruptcy, I realize I don't miss the relationship we had. I mourn what we never had, but I don't actually miss what existed. I'd understood exactly what she meant. Other relatives had similarly distanced themselves. Not because I'd asked them to, not because I'd spread stories or demanded loyalty. Simply because once the legal facts became public record, my father's pattern of manipulation became undeniable. The devoted husband and father persona he'd cultivated for decades couldn't survive the documented evidence of what he'd actually done. Aunt Linda still Christmas carded him, I heard. Uncle Mark called on his birthday. But the weekly phone calls, the regular visits, the sense of being central to a family network, all of that had evaporated. He was surrounded by the same silence he'd once weaponized against me, the same isolation he'd used as punishment. But nobody was punishing him now. They'd simply stopped prioritizing his needs over their own peace. In March, I ran into an old friend of my father's at the grocery store, Bill Henderson, someone who'd known my parents for 30 years. He recognized me first. "Kimberly, I thought that was you. How are you?" We made small talk in the produce section, the conversation carefully neutral. Then, as we were parting, he hesitated. "I saw your dad last month," he said. "We had coffee. He's different. Smaller somehow. We talked about old times, and he said something that stuck with me." Bill glanced around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "He said he'd spent his whole life building something that didn't matter and destroyed everything that did. I don't think he was talking about money." I felt something tighten in my throat. Did he say that about my mother, about me and Rebecca? He didn't name names, but yeah, I think that's what he meant. Bill looked uncomfortable. "I know things got complicated with your family. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty or asking you to do anything. I just thought, I don't know. I thought you should know he's thinking about it." "Thank you for telling me," I said, and I meant it. After Bill left, I stood in the produce section holding a bag of apples, processing this information. My father had acknowledged, at least to a friend, that he'd destroyed what mattered. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't directed at me. But it was a recognition of cause and effect of choices and consequences. Years ago, I would have needed that recognition. I would have craved his understanding, his admission of guilt, his remorse. I would have thought that hearing him acknowledge what he'd done would somehow heal the wound or validate my decision to walk away. But standing there in the grocery store, I realized I didn't need it. His understanding or lack thereof changed nothing about my reality. I'd built a life that didn't require his validation, his remorse, or his involvement. Whether he spent his remaining years in denial or in belated self-awareness made no difference to the peace I'd found. The consequences he was experiencing, the financial devastation, the social isolation, the physical frailty compounded by loneliness. These weren't punishments I'd inflicted. They were the natural results of how he'd chosen to live. He'd built an empire on control, using debt to manipulate Rebecca, using guilt to manipulate me, using performance to manipulate everyone else. He'd constructed an entire identity around being the patriarch, the provider, the man who held all the power. But control-based systems are inherently unstable. They require constant maintenance, constant enforcement, and they collapse the moment someone refuses to comply. I'd been the first refusal, the crack in the foundation. Everything that crumbled after that was already structurally unsound. I wasn't glad he was suffering. I wasn't vindictively satisfied by his isolation. But I also wasn't responsible for fixing it, for sacrificing my peace to ease his regret, for returning to a dynamic that had nearly destroyed me just because he'd finally recognized the damage he'd caused. Sometimes people realize too late what they've lost. Sometimes they understand finally that the things they thought would bring them security money, control the appearance of family unity, meant nothing compared to genuine connection, trust, and love. But that realization doesn't obligate the people they harmed to return and provide comfort. He'd spent decades building an empire of control. In the end, he was left with only what everyone eventually faces: the consequences of who they chose to be. The knowledge that my father had some limited awareness of what he'd destroyed didn't change my daily life, but it did make me think more about Rebecca. We'd had those 2 awkward coffee meetings over the past year, but mostly we'd existed in a strange limbo, no longer enemies, not yet anything resembling sisters. Then in February 2025, I received a text from her that was longer than anything she'd sent before. It arrived on a Sunday evening while I was making dinner. "Kimberly, I know I don't deserve your time or attention. I know I hurt you by choosing silence when I should have stood up. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for us to be sisters again. I don't even know if we ever really were. I just want you to know that I'm working on becoming someone who wouldn't make those choices again. I'm in therapy twice a week. I declared bankruptcy last year, and I'm rebuilding my financial life from scratch. But this time, honestly, I left Jake 3 months ago. It turns out we'd been staying together for the kids, but staying in a marriage built on hiding problems was teaching them exactly the wrong lessons. I'm teaching my kids now that loyalty doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that family should be a source of support, not stress, that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. You were right about all of it, and I was wrong. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to respond to this. I just needed to say it." I read the message 3 times. The length alone was significant. Rebecca had sent brief texts over the past year, checking in superficially, but nothing like this. This was specific. This was accountability. And most importantly, it didn't ask anything of me. That last part made all the difference. She wasn't asking me to absolve her or rescue her or even respond. She was simply stating what she'd done wrong and what she was doing differently. There was no implicit demand that I fix things or make her feel better about her guilt. I sat with the message for 2 days before responding. Finally, I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me this. I'm glad you're working on yourself. That takes courage." Her response was immediate. "Can we maybe get coffee sometime? No pressure." We set a date for April, 2 months away. The distance felt right, not immediate, not rushed, but not indefinite either. When April arrived, we met at a neutral location, a coffee shop neither of us had been to before, in a part of town that held no memories for either of us. I arrived first, ordering a latte and sitting at a corner table where I could see the entrance. My stomach was tight with nervousness, though I couldn't entirely identify what I was nervous about. Rebecca arrived exactly on time, looking different than I remembered. Thinner, yes, but also more present somehow. Less of the performative energy I'd always associated with her. She ordered her own coffee before joining me, which I appreciated. She wasn't expecting me to buy. Hers wasn't setting up even the small transactional dynamics that had characterized so much of our past. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, sitting down across from me. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, both of us sipping our drinks. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "I've been working with my therapist on accountability, not just saying I'm sorry in a general way, but actually naming what I did wrong." She took a breath. "So I want to do that now if you're okay with hearing it." I nodded. "The Christmas trip. I knew Dad was planning to exclude you. He told me 2 weeks before the trip that he'd modified the reservation, that you weren't coming, that we were going on dates you couldn't make. I knew, and I didn't tell you. I didn't warn you. I let you find out the way you did because it was easier for me not to get involved." Her eyes were filling with tears, but she continued. "The family meeting where Dad tried to get us to sign that release form. I signed it without reading it because I was too afraid to question him. But I knew you would read it. I knew you'd see what it really was. And part of me hoped you'd stop both of us, that you'd be strong enough for both of us, so I wouldn't have to be." She wiped at her eyes. "All those years when Dad would call you for money, I knew it was unfair. I knew you were being treated like an ATM while I was being treated like the golden child. I knew, and I said nothing because it benefited me. Every time you sent money, it took pressure off me. Every time you were the problem child, it made me look better. I used you as a shield, Kimberly. I let you take all the hits while I stayed safe." The words hung between us. This was more honesty than we'd shared in our entire lives. No deflection, no, but I was scared to soften it. Just the hard truth of what she'd done. "I told myself I was protecting my kids by going along with Dad," Rebecca continued. "But I was really just protecting myself from having to be uncomfortable. I was protecting myself from losing the golden child status, from having to face Dad's anger, from having to admit I was being financially controlled through debt. And you paid the price for my cowardice." I felt tears in my own eyes now, not from sadness exactly, but from the relief of finally being seen, of having someone in my family acknowledge what had actually happened instead of gaslighting me about it. "Thank you for saying that," I managed. "All of that. It doesn't fix anything," Rebecca said quickly. "I know that. I'm not saying it to make you forgive me or to feel better about myself. I'm saying it because it's true and you deserve to hear someone acknowledge it years ago." We talked for nearly 2 hours. Rebecca told me about her therapy, about the bankruptcy process, about leaving Jake and how terrifying and liberating it had been. She talked about having to explain to her kids why they were moving to a smaller apartment, how she'd decided to be honest with them about financial reality, rather than hiding it the way our parents had hidden everything. "I'm teaching them that it's okay to say no," she said. "That they don't owe anyone unlimited access to their resources or their emotional energy just because someone is family. I wish someone had taught us that." I told her about my life too. The support group, Diana's friendship, the decision to sell the house. I didn't share everything. There were parts of my journey that felt too private, too hard-won to expose to someone who'd been part of the wounding. But I shared enough to let her know I'd built something good, something healthy, something that didn't require her participation to be valid. As we were leaving, Rebecca said, "I don't expect us to be close. I don't expect regular Sunday dinners or holiday traditions. But maybe we could do this again sometime. Coffee every few months, just checking in." I considered it. The old Kimberly would have either said yes to please her or no to punish her. The new Kimberly could evaluate what she actually wanted. "I think I'd like that," I said. "With boundaries, with honesty. But yes." Over the months that followed, we developed exactly that, a limited, boundaried relationship. We met for coffee every 3 or 4 months. We texted occasionally about neutral topics, a book one of us had read, a movie recommendation, updates on her kids. Rebecca never asked me for money, never asked me to mediate with our father, never asked me to carry her emotional burdens, and I never tried to parent her or rescue her or fix her life. I didn't offer unsolicited advice or try to manage her choices. We were 2 adults who'd survived the same traumatic family system, who were both working to heal from it, who could offer each other the occasional coffee and conversation without demanding more than the other could give. It wasn't the sisterhood I'd imagined as a child, when I'd looked at Rebecca and wished we could be close. It wasn't the fairy tale reconciliation where we'd become best friends and laugh about the past. It was something more honest and more sustainable: mutual respect, shared understanding, and the acknowledgement that we'd both been damaged by the same system, even if in different ways. At our 3rd coffee meeting in October, Rebecca said something that stayed with me. "I used to think freedom was terrifying," she said. "Freedom from Dad's control, from the debt, from the marriage that wasn't working. I thought being free would mean being completely alone, that I'd lose everything. And I did lose a lot: my credit, my house, the version of my life I'd been performing. But what I gained—" She paused, searching for words. "I gained myself. I can make choices now without constantly calculating what someone else will take from me. I can breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's not easy. I'm still broke, still figuring things out. But I'm free. She looked at me with something like wonder. You knew that years before I did. You walked away when I was still too scared to even acknowledge the cage existed. I spent so long thinking you were the difficult one, the ungrateful one. But you were just the first one brave enough to choose freedom. I felt something shift in my chest. This was as close to healing as we might ever get. Not erasing the past, not pretending the damage hadn't been real, but acknowledging it honestly and choosing something different going forward. Freedom does cost something, I said. It cost me a relationship with Dad. It cost me most of the extended family. It cost me years of guilt and questioning whether I was a good person. But staying trapped... I met her eyes. That would have cost me everything. My sense of self, my peace, my ability to build genuine relationships. The price of staying was higher than the price of leaving. I just realized it before you did. Rebecca nodded slowly. I'm still learning that, but I'm learning it. We finished our coffee and parted ways with a brief hug, tentative but genuine. As I drove home, I thought about the strange path that had brought us here. We weren't close. We might never be. But we'd established something I'd never had with her before: honesty. And sometimes mutual respect built on shared truth was more valuable than forced intimacy built on denial. My sister learned what I'd known for years. Freedom costs something, but staying trapped costs everything. It's December 2025 now, 2 full years since that first peaceful Christmas at Diana's house, and I'm sitting in my living room in Sedona, the small house I bought with part of the proceeds from selling my childhood home. The view from my window looks out over red rocks that change color with the light, and the quiet here is profound in a way that still sometimes catches me off guard. I'm 38 years old. That feels significant somehow, like I'm finally the age I was always meant to be: old enough to have learned hard lessons, young enough to have time to live differently because of them. The journey from family only to here wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of crushing doubt, days when I questioned everything I'd done and wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But sitting here now in this space that's entirely mine, built with resources I protected and choices I made for myself, I can see the path clearly. And I can see what I've learned. Not easy lessons, not comfortable truths, but wisdom earned through genuine pain and difficult choices. I've been thinking lately about what I'd tell other women who might be where I was. Women who are reading this story and seeing themselves in it, recognizing the patterns, even if the details are different. Because I know you're out there. I've met dozens of you in support groups, heard your stories, seen the same confusion and guilt and desperate hope that maybe if you just try harder, sacrifice more, stay quieter, eventually you'll earn the love and respect you've been chasing your whole life. So let me tell you what I've learned, what I wish someone had told me decades ago. Family isn't a magic word that erases harm. It's not a shield against accountability or a free pass to accept mistreatment. Real family, whether biological or chosen, lifts you up when you succeed, respects your boundaries, when you set them, and values you for who you are rather than what you can provide. Real family doesn't make you disappear so they can shine brighter. Real family doesn't use "but we're family" as a reason you should tolerate behavior you'd never accept from a stranger. If someone says you're family only when they need your money, your labor, your silence, or your absence, but you're not family when they're distributing love, respect, recognition, or inheritance, they've already told you what you are to them. You're a resource, not a relation. You're utility, not humanity. Believing them the first time, taking them at their word instead of making excuses for them, saves you years of pain. My mother tried to teach me this even from beyond death. Her hidden will wasn't just about a house or money. It was about showing me that I deserved protection, that she valued me enough to fight for me even while dying, that being the practical one didn't mean I had to be the sacrificial one. She was telling me in the clearest way she could that I mattered, that my worth wasn't contingent on how much I could endure. I spent 36 years believing that sacrifice without limits was noble, that enduring pain silently made me strong, that being low maintenance was a virtue. I was praised for these qualities, praised for not needing much attention, for solving my own problems, for being reliable and steady, and always available when needed. But those praises were really just applause for my willingness to erase myself. There's a difference between healthy sacrifice and self-erasure, though it took me decades to understand it. Healthy sacrifice comes from love and is reciprocated. It's the give and take of genuine relationships, where both people sometimes put the other first, where both people sometimes receive support, where the balance might shift, but never becomes permanently one-sided. Healthy sacrifice makes you tired sometimes, but doesn't make you disappear. Self-erasure is different. Self-erasure is when your family only values you for what you can give them, when your presence is less important than your utility, when you have to become smaller so others can be bigger. When you're praised for being low maintenance, while your sister's high maintenance gets her everything she needs. When you're told you're strong and independent as justification for why you don't deserve support. When your absence from family events is convenient and your presence is inconvenient. That's not family. That's exploitation with a DNA connection. And walking away from that isn't selfish, it's survival. I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too for so long. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm being too sensitive? What if I just tried harder, was more patient, gave them one more chance? I spent years in that loop, second-guessing my reality, making excuses for people who'd shown me repeatedly exactly who they were. Here's what I finally understood. If you're constantly questioning whether you're being too sensitive, that's usually a sign you're being too accommodating. If you have to convince yourself that mistreatment is acceptable, it's not. If you're working harder to maintain a relationship than the other person is, the relationship isn't balanced, and you can't fix imbalance through solo effort. You cannot love someone into valuing you. You cannot sacrifice enough to earn respect from people who fundamentally see you as a resource rather than a person. You cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm and expect them to care that you're burning. So if you're reading this and recognizing yourself, if you're the daughter who always gives the sister who always covers emergencies, the family member whose needs always come last, the one who's praised for being practical while being treated as disposable, please hear me. You deserve more than being someone's safety net. You deserve to be someone's priority, and if the people in your life can't see your worth unless you're writing checks or staying silent if they say family only, while taking what you've given if they praise you for qualities that really just mean you're easy to exploit, then believe what they're telling you. They've already decided you don't belong. They've already categorized you as utility rather than family. The only question is how long you'll pretend otherwise. My mother left me an inheritance, but it wasn't really the house. The house was just the vehicle for the real inheritance, the lesson that I deserved protection, that I was worth fighting for, that I didn't have to accept erasure as the price of belonging. She showed me that my inheritance isn't what people give me, it's what I refuse to let them take. They tried to take my money, my time, my emotional energy, my sense of self-worth, my peace. For 36 years, I let them. Then I stopped, and everything changed. Not immediately, not easily, not without cost. I lost relationships, though. Looking back, I question whether I ever really had them. I lost the fantasy of the family I'd always hoped for. I lost the comfortable story I'd told myself about why things were the way they were. I gained clarity. I gained peace. I gained a life built on truth rather than performance, on boundaries rather than unlimited availability, on chosen family rather than obligatory connection. Walking away wasn't giving up. It was finally, after 36 years, choosing myself. I think about younger women, sometimes women in their 20s or 30s, who are just starting to recognize the patterns I took decades to see. I think about women my age or older who've spent even more years than I did trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given. I think about my mother, who recognized the pattern but ran out of time to escape it herself. And I want to tell all of them, it's not too late. It's never too late to choose yourself, to set boundaries, to walk away from dynamics that diminish you. It's never too late to build a life where your worth isn't contingent on your utility, where your presence is celebrated rather than tolerated, where family means support rather than exploitation. The cost of leaving might feel enormous when you're standing at the edge of that decision. The cost of staying is always higher. It just accrues so slowly that you don't notice you're paying it until you've lost yourself entirely. I'm 38. I'm sitting in a house I bought with money that's truly mine. Money I protected from people who saw it as theirs by right. I have friendships built on mutual respect. I have a relationship with my sister that's honest, even if it's limited. I have peace. My father is alone dealing with consequences that are entirely of his own making. I don't celebrate that. But I also don't rescue him from it. Some people need to sit with the results of their choices before they can understand what those choices actually cost. And whether or not he ever understands my life doesn't depend on his enlightenment. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do isn't fight harder to be included. It's walk away from people who were never going to see her worth and build a life where she doesn't need them to. That's the real inheritance my mother left me. And it's the inheritance I'm leaving you if you need it. Permission to choose yourself, to protect yourself, to believe that you deserve better than the crumbs you've been grateful for. You do deserve better. And choosing better isn't selfish. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do. If Kimberly's story resonated with you, you're not alone. Thousands of people face similar situations where family obligation becomes family exploitation, where love is conditional on utility, and where setting boundaries feels like betrayal. But as Kimberly discovered, the real betrayal isn't walking away from people who hurt you. It's staying in relationships that require you to disappear. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the practical one in your family, the person everyone depends on but no one truly sees? Have you struggled with guilt after setting boundaries with toxic family members? Or maybe you're still in that place. Kimberly was questioning whether you're being too sensitive, wondering if you should just try harder. Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We share true stories about resilience, justice, and the courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone else expects you to disappear. Your subscription tells us these stories matter, that there's value in honest conversations about family dysfunction, boundaries, and the hard-won freedom that comes from walking away. And if you know someone who needs to hear Kimberly's story, someone who's been the family's designated fixer or the one who always gives without receiving, share this video with them. Sometimes we need to see our own story reflected in someone else's before we can recognize what we deserve. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, your worth isn't measured by how much you can endure. You deserve better, and choosing better is always possible.